Chapter 27:15. The future that Luo Fan chose at this time was naturally the future that didn't have the aura of tribulations. It wasn't difficult to choose such a future. Even if so many futures were covered by the aura of tribulations, it was impossible for the aura of tribulations to completely cover all the futures. The part of the future that was covered was ultimately only a part. It was really easy to find a future that wasn't covered by the aura of tribulations among the countless futures. And choosing a certain future wouldn't affect the future development of this world. Infinity within infinity was also infinity. Any point in time had an infinite future, and a certain future among these infinite futures also had its own infinite future. Just like that, even if Luo Fan chose one of the infinite futures to be the future of this world, it wouldn't cause the future to have no other possibilities just because of such a choice. It wouldn't cause the future to turn into a path with no future. Even if he stepped into this future, the future would still be infinite. All the possibilities of the future still existed. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan didn't have any psychological barriers when choosing this future. However, although it was simple to choose a certain future, it wasn't easy to completely turn the timeline towards this future and make all the futures converge towards this future. At this moment, Luo Fan felt an unimaginable resistance emanating from the river of time. This resistance was extremely ordinary at the beginning, just like the force he exerted. But as the force he exerted on it grew stronger, the resistance also grew stronger. In the end, the force even made Luo Fan's body and mind tremble violently. He faintly felt that his existence was about to be expelled from this world. The river of time itself was a part of this world, and it could be said to be a certain attribute of this world. At this moment, the astonishing resistance that erupted from the river of time seemed to have gathered all the power, and mysteries of this world. The final result was that even Luo Fan, the creator of this world, was faintly unable to bear it and was about to leave this world under the effect of this repulsive force. This situation made Luo Fan frown slightly. One must know that it was precisely because he knew the special characteristics of the River of Time and understood that the River of Time was a part of the world of laws. It was also because of this that he had the confidence to use such a direct method to reverse the flow of the River of Time and prevent the River of Time from being destroyed by the calamity. After all, he was the creator of this world. Everything in this world originated from him, and he could change everything with a single thought. However, he didn't expect that it would be so difficult to change the River of Time. Even he, the creator of the River of Time, found it difficult to control. He was unable to change the River of Time according to his will. Luo Fan continued to exert more force, almost causing him to be expelled by the world of laws. He knew that it was impossible for such a direct method to succeed. If this were to continue, the greatest possibility would be that he, the creator of the world, would be directly rejected by the world. After understanding this, he could only stop moving. What should I do? This question surfaced in his heart. The flow of the River of Time had to be changed. If it didn't change, then according to the method of renting the power of the calamity, the world of laws would eventually be destroyed. It would turn into ruins under the power of the calamity and be completely annihilated. Luo Fan absolutely rejected such an outcome. He had to find a way to avoid it no matter what. With this thought in mind, he observed the River of Time aimlessly. He watched as the River of Time continued to flow towards the future, watching as the countless futures gradually became the past at this point in time. Suddenly, he had a flash of inspiration and looked at the entire River of Time. Why is the power of the tribulations able to change the future? Even I, the creator, was repelled by the world when I tried to do this. How is the power of the tribulations able to surpass me, the creator of the world? This question surfaced in his heart. As this question arose, the aura of the calamity that filled the entire River of Time, be it the past, present, or future, was reflected in his eyes. After seeing this aura, he suddenly understood what he had to do. This method of using the power of the calamity was not like what he had done before, which was to directly reverse the flow of the river of time and directly twist the river of time to the future, where the power of the calamity would completely destroy the world of laws. Instead, starting from the beginning of the river of time, it spread its power throughout the past, present, and future of the river of time, exerting influence on the river of time from every point in time. At every point in time, it would strive to obtain a little bit of results and gain a little bit of advantage. In the end, its influence and advantages would accumulate until at some point in time, it would truly reverse the river of time and turn the world of laws into a future that the calamity hoped to see. This method was just like if one wanted to nurture a living being into a certain kind of talent, one needed to exert influence on the living being from the moment it was born, from the moment it first learned. In the end, at a certain point in time, it would grow into that kind of talent. However, it would not directly distort its will at some point in time and make it directly choose to become that kind of talent. The river of time was obviously that kind of creature, and the future was a variety of talents. Wanting to make the river of time turn into a certain future was equivalent to cultivating the creature into a talent in a certain field. Luo Fan's previous method was like directly making the creature choose a certain field at the point of choosing a job, a field that the creature itself was extremely against. In that case, it would naturally be extremely difficult, and it would suffer a backlash from the creature. The method of the calamity was to exert influence on the creature from time to time from the moment it was born. For example, it would instill into the creature how good a certain field was, how promising a certain field was, how much a certain field could bring to it, and so on. Unknowingly, it would change the mindset of the creature. In this way, when it came time to choose a job, the creature would naturally and voluntarily choose that field and complete the goal of the power of the calamity. It was self-evident which of the two methods was more ingenious. After seeing this clearly, Luo Fan naturally knew what he should do. Fortunately, this world of laws was created by him. His power could naturally connect to the past, present, and future of this world of laws. Therefore, it was not difficult for the power of the calamity to send its aura to the moment the world was born or to the end of the river of time. With a slight thought, his power had already spread to every inch of the entire river of time, covering countless points of time from the birth of this world of laws to the present, and then to a certain future. Boundless power continued to pour out, pouring into the river of time. At this moment, a subtle feeling of emptiness emerged from the bottom of his heart. Although this feeling of emptiness was quickly made up for by the endless power that was naturally born in his body, it returned to its perfect state. However, emptiness was emptiness. The emptiness caused by the exhaustion of the power in his body was something that Luo Fan had not felt for billions of years. Ever since he became a Khanate Grand Heavenly Luo and gained the ability to be self-sufficient, Luo Fan had almost never worried about the power in his body. All he cared about was the realm, the profoundness, and the various changes that he could not understand. However, now that he had reached the peak of the Sixth Tribulation Realm and was not much weaker than ordinary Seventh Tribulation Realm powerhouses, he once again felt the emptiness of the power in his body being exhausted in the face of the world of laws and the river of time that he had created. This situation made him feel a little shocked. Given his current state, if the power in his body were to really erupt, he could instantly crush a group of worlds, let alone a world. In terms of quantity alone, it could be said that even if thousands of worlds were to use all their means to extract the power in his body at the same time, he probably would not feel any emptiness because of it. From this, it could be said that the appearance of this emptiness represented something. Luo Fan was slightly surprised by this emptiness, but he put it aside. This was because he had already figured out the reason behind it. Although the river of time was called a long river, there was actually no water or sand in it. What it did have was a world of laws and a world of laws. The entire river of time was actually laid out in the order of the flow of time by the world of laws and the endless points of time. From the birth of the world and the appearance of time until now, the answer to how many points of time could time be divided into was infinite. spreading from the present all the way to the past, covering every point of time in the past and present with his power. How many laws of heaven and earth were involved? The answer was naturally the number of points of time, which meant that it was infinite. No matter what it was, when the prefix infinite was added, it would become extremely terrifying. Even if Luo Fan only covered these points of time with his own power did not actually consume too much. However, just this stacking had caused him to exhaust an unimaginable amount of energy. In practically an instant, the energy and might within his body had been completely exhausted. It was so much so that even his unimaginable recovery speed could not keep up with it. It was because of this that he felt this emptiness. However, this feeling of emptiness only lasted for a moment. As Luo Fan realized the speed at which the river of time absorbed power, he began to adjust the speed at which the power in his body were produced. Very soon, he had already re-established the balance between power and power, allowing his body to quickly maintain an extremely perfect state. Fortunately, this world was created by me. At this moment, Luo Fan could not help but think. If this world wasn't created by him, he wouldn't have had the opportunity to consume power like this at all. In order to completely cover an infinite point of time and an infinite world of laws, one would need to have an equally infinite power. Obviously, an ordinary cultivator would not be able to take out such an infinite amount of power, unless one was a true saint. Who else could have infinite power? Only Luo Fan, as the creator of this world, had absolute control over this world, which allowed him to bypass this infinite limit and use his own power to exhaust the entire river of time, covering every point of time above the river of time with his power. However, as the creator of this world, there was a limit to his authority. He had already done his best to bypass the limit, and it was impossible for him to completely avoid the exhaustion of his power and energy. In order to cover every point of time with his power, Luo Fan spent dozens of days. At a certain moment after dozens of days, he felt his body tremble, and the entire river of time was completely imprinted in his perception. Every detail, every change that could be affected, and even any influence that the power of the tribulations had on it were completely imprinted in his heart. In a trance, his heart moved slightly, and an inexplicable expression appeared on his face. I see. As he thought of this, the power that covered every point of time began to undergo various subtle changes without him making any movements. Under these subtle changes, an indescribable distortion appeared in the river of time. Amidst the distortion, the power of the tribulations that originally covered the entire river of time was repelled in various unbelievable ways. Many points of time in the river of time began to tremble violently, and strands of power kept breaking away from the river of time, or rather, breaking away from the world of laws at those points of time. These powers were naturally affected by Luo Fan's power. Chapter 27:16. Wisps of tribulation power gradually broke away from the river of time. They stuck to each other and connected with each other, gradually turning into a strange mist that shrouded the river of time. It was as if a strange cloud had appeared there. Following this change, the forks that were filled with the aura of tribulations at the border between the present and the future began to decrease rapidly. Evidently, because the aura of the past tribulations had been expelled, the possibility of the world developing towards the end, where it would be completely destroyed by the tribulations, was greatly reduced. Seeing this, Luo Fan knew that his plan had achieved initial success. Using this method, it was indeed possible to avoid the calamity and completely change the future of this world. In fact, compared to what he had imagined before, the current situation seemed to be even more perfect. Previously, he had thought of using a similar method to forcefully twist the future to a future where there was no possibility of the tribulations destroying the world. But from the looks of it now, he did not need to go through so much trouble at all. He probably only needed to expel the aura of the past tribulations, and the future where the tribulations destroyed the world would completely disappear. He did not need to do anything else at all. Faced with such a situation, There was no need to say what choice Luo Fan would make. At this moment, he poured even more power into the river of time, flowing towards the world of laws at every point in time in the past. As more and more power was poured in, the power of the tribulations was expelled more and more. The forks that were filled with the aura of the past began to decrease. At this point in time, the various existences that had been destroyed in the past or had yet to appear in the future began to disappear rapidly. Moreover, after they disappeared, the memories that they left in the hearts of all living beings also began to disappear rapidly. In other words, the living beings that had seen these existences that should not have appeared in the world completely forgot that they had seen them after they disappeared. Even the consequences caused by the existence of these existences were completely reversed, as if nothing had happened. Only Luo Fan was able to see all these strange changes. All other living beings, including the fake saints, did not notice it at all. They were also one of the living beings, and they were also suffering from the erasure of memories. This process lasted for an unknown period of time. At some point in time, a strange tremor suddenly appeared above the river of time and light. In that instant, the entire river of time produced an indescribable repulsive force, directly acting on the tribulations that had been repelled but still shrouded the river of time. For a time, the might of the tribulation became extremely turbulent, and the river of time started to undergo subtle changes. It seemed to have become more complete, and it seemed to have become pure. Under the repulsive effect of the river of time, the various tribulations that enveloped the river of time rapidly collapsed and disintegrated. In the end, they vanished without a trace, as if they had never appeared. Eliminated. At this moment, Luo Fan came to a realization. The omen of this tribulation had been eliminated by him once again. The omen of the tribulation this time was even more mysterious, strange, and untraceable than the ones that had erupted from the hearts of the living beings before. Previously, the omen of the tribulation that had appeared from the depths of the living beings' hearts could still work. However, the omen of the tribulation that had appeared above the river of time this time could not even be sensed by the heavenly Tao. Now that the omen of the tribulation had been eliminated, the heavenly Tao still did not sense it at all, as if nothing had happened at all. From this, Luo Fan could also see the limitations of the heavenly Tao. While Luo Fan was thinking of a way to completely eliminate the omen of the tribulation that had appeared above the river of time, the process of transcending the tribulation in the transportation network gradually came to an end. However, the results of their transcendence varied. Among the many worlds, only a small portion of the benefits of transcending the tribulation in the most perfect manner were able to truly transcend the tribulation. In terms of quantity, it was less than 1,000 cubic meters. Most of the remaining worlds had transcended the tribulation, but their own worlds were severely damaged. They needed to spend most of the benefits they had obtained after transcending the tribulation to repair their worlds. However, the last small portion could not even do that. In the end, they could not withstand the attack of the tribulation at all, and their worlds were destroyed. Of course, there were also a few encounters for the creators of these worlds that could not withstand the tribulation and were completely destroyed. Some of them had quick reflexes and managed to escape before the world was about to be destroyed. Although the creators of this world had lost their own world, they did not suffer too much damage. Not only did they have the chance to start again, but they would also comprehend many things in the process due to the impact of the tribulation, making their foundations more solid. If they started again, their starting point would be much better than before. As for the remaining creators of these worlds, most of them did not react in time and were more or less damaged when their worlds were destroyed. Such pioneers of the world still had the chance to start over, but at least for the time being, or in other words, for a long time to come, they would not be able to seize this chance. That was because they needed a long period of time to recover their bodies and minds and recover from their injuries. In the end, the small portion of the remaining creators of these worlds were those that had fused too deeply with the world or reacted too slowly. In the end, they did not manage to escape after their worlds were destroyed. However, They had died along with the destruction of the world, and their souls had dispersed. There were more than 100 world founders who died, and their souls dispersed. As for those that had been destroyed, there were close to 1,000 of them. A tenth of the creators had perished along with the world. Although this proportion was high, it was still a considerable amount. When Luo Fan eliminated the omen of the tribulation and turned his gaze to the many worlds in the transportation network layer, he could not help but sigh inwardly when he saw the losses. It must be known that the creators were all geniuses. If they became his strength, it would be enough for him to use many more means to deal with the tribulation layer. Now that he had lost over 100 of them, the loss was a little too great. However, those thoughts only flashed through his mind. Although there were quite a few losses, these losses were nothing compared to the rewards they had reaped. Compared to Luo Fan, who felt that it was a pity, the other creators did not feel that much. At this time, they were all excited about their own good fortune. Those who had passed the tribulation perfectly were using their peak state to absorb the various benefits given by the tribulation layer. They were trying their best to feel the wonderful feeling of the world and themselves metamorphosing at the same time. So how could they have the mood to pay attention to the situation of the other worlds? On the other hand, the creators who had not passed the tribulation perfectly were trying their best to control all the benefits given by the tribulation layer. They were trying their best to use those benefits to repair and refine the world. They even wanted to magnify a single benefit 10 times so that they could leave more benefits for their world, so that they could undergo greater metamorphosis. It was even more impossible for them to pay attention to the situation of the other worlds. As for the creators who had not passed the tribulation and were destroyed, they didn't notice the many creators that had been destroyed along with the world. However, so what if they noticed it? At this moment, they would only be glad that they had escaped quickly and that they had made a prompt decision. They would not feel emotional about the destruction of the creators. After all, before the transportation network layer was completely established, the many creators did not have much contact with each other. In terms of friendship, it was impossible for them to have much. Without much friendship, they would naturally only see their own reflections of the past from the other creators. How could they feel emotional about it so easily? That was why, in the end, after the world founders were destroyed, not a single one of the world founders in the transportation network felt any sorrow for their deaths. All they felt was indifference. At this moment, the tribulation layer above the transportation network layer became more and more blurry. Only a faint, indistinct shadow was left in the clan. As for the countless tribulation channels that extended down from the tribulation layer like lines of rain that led to the depths of the hearts and minds of the many living beings in the world, they gradually disappeared. Of course, they only disappeared. Luo Fan could clearly sense that they still existed and were still connected to the hearts and minds of the many living beings in the various worlds in the same way. However, at this moment, the passageways had yet to be truly activated. There was still no power pouring into the world through the passageways, or rather, into the hearts and minds of the many living beings in the world. That was why all of this was hidden. However, even if it had disappeared, Luo Fan could still sense a vague and indistinct shadow in the tribulation layer. This was the true existence of the tribulation layer, but it would not disappear just because the power of the tribulation layer did not take effect. When Luo Fan learned about the existence of the tribulation layer, learned how it worked, and understood that the essence of the tribulation layer was above the transportation network layer, the existence of the tribulation layer could no longer escape his senses. Even though the tribulation layer no longer had any effect on the transportation network layer and seemed to no longer have any power pouring into any of the worlds, he could still sense its existence. Looks like it's going to stop for a while. Luo Fan came to a realization when he saw this scene. Simulating the state of chaos was extremely mysterious and wonderful, even though it was only a simulation of the state of chaos. However, compared to an existence like Luo Fan, this kind of simulation already gave it the characteristics of the true state of chaos. Just like this moment, he clearly knew that there were millions of worlds in this simulated state of chaos, but he could not sense their existence no matter how he tried. Even if those heavens and earth were already under his control, it was still the same. All sorts of thoughts flashed through his mind. Suddenly, bits of inspiration appeared in his mind. Perhaps this isn't absolute against the tribulation layer. If I can sense it, could it be that these worlds are more profound than the tribulation layer? As he thought of this, an indescribable light flashed through his eyes. The tribulation level was an existence that was above the transportation network level. It could even pour all sorts of unimaginable power into all the worlds in the transportation network layer. No matter how he looked at it, such an existence was more profound than any of the worlds in the transportation network layer. If he could even sense the tribulation layer through the transportation network layer, could he really not have any way to sense those worlds? This situation was impossible no matter how he looked at it, right? As he thought of this, a faint understanding appeared on his face. I was prejudiced by my first impression. At this time, he already understood that the fundamental reason why he could not sense the existence of those worlds was because he was prejudiced by his first impression and believed that he could not sense them. He believed that those worlds were separated from the transportation network layer, which was equivalent to being separated from his range of perception. If he had not believed in this, he would have been able to sense the existence of those worlds a long time ago. It was just like when his world of laws had just been born. At that time, there was no transportation network layer. In fact, there wasn't even any connection with other worlds. Even so, he could see the countless worlds turn into a sky full of stars. The current situation was a little more complicated than before, and the changes in those worlds also made it very different from before. However, in essence, were these worlds really different from before to the extent that he could not sense them at all? After thinking about this, Luo Fan was already very clear about what he should do. Chapter 27:17. As he moved, the boundless darkness in his eyes began to undergo various subtle changes. There seemed to be all kinds of blurry and indistinct shadows appearing in the darkness. Vaguely, there seemed to be balls of strange light appearing and disappearing one after another. These balls of light were faintly discernible, and within those balls of light, there were countless tiny spots of light. At first glance, it seemed to be similar to the simulated state of chaos that he had sensed with the help of the world of laws when he first constructed the world of laws. However, the truth was that there was a fundamental difference between this scene and the one before. It wasn't because the countless balls of light and spots of light were blurry and indistinct. They weren't clear at all. It was also because at this moment, the countless balls of light and spots of light that appeared in his perception were simply multicolored and extremely gorgeous. Countless multicolored light dots adorned the endless pitch-black sky, causing the pitch-black sky to no longer have the desolation and deathly stillness from before. Instead, there was an additional indescribable liveliness. Is this the true, simulated state of chaos? Looking at this scene, such a thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. He felt as if his worldview was about to be overturned. However, he quickly denied his own thoughts. No, this might not be the true truth of the simulated state of chaos. Perhaps this is only a small part of the true state of chaos. What I'm seeing now might be the same as what I saw back then. It might not be complete. With this thought in mind, the expression on his face became calm again. It was enough to make a mistake once, but to make the same mistake repeatedly was something that would never happen to him. Even with his current strength, his understanding of the simulated state of chaos was much stronger than before. However, he wasn't absolutely confident that the simulated state of chaos that he understood at this time was the truth of the simulated state of chaos. The principles contained in it were also the principles contained in all simulated states of chaos. With this understanding, he naturally understood that the simulation of the primal chaos state only had an extremely small probability of being the truth of the entire simulated primal chaos state. Everything that existed in the simulated state of chaos was already everything that existed in the simulated state of chaos. All kinds of thoughts flashed through his mind, and his mind became even more solemn. At that moment, he carefully distinguished them. Very soon, some light spots became clear in his senses. There were two balls of light that seemed to be quite close to each other. The two balls of light gave off an inexplicable sense of familiarity. This inexplicable sense of familiarity told him that the two balls of light were none other than the two worlds formed by the convergence of many worlds that had transcended from the transportation network layer. The reason why it was a ball of light and not just a speck of light like the other worlds were. The reason was actually quite simple. Although those heavens and earths had already fused the heavens and earths they had created into a whole, forming a world of their own. However, this kind of fusion was obviously quite preliminary. In essence, those worlds were still those worlds, and they were still incompatible with each other. This kind of incompatibility couldn't be more obvious in the eyes of a truly brilliant existence. Obviously, Luo Fan was a truly brilliant existence. This kind of incompatibility was extremely clear in his eyes, and he didn't try to hide it at all. In this way, in his eyes, or rather in his senses, those light spots didn't gather into a whole, and that was why they directly split into so many light spots and gathered into a ball of light. It became a river system in this boundless, pitch-black void. Of course, or rather, it was another river system in this incomparably bustling void. And the fates of these two balls of light were also different. At this moment, one of the balls of light was already becoming more and more stable. The connection between the many light spots within the ball of light was constantly deepening, and the light spots were fusing with each other bit by bit. On the other hand, the other ball of light was completely the opposite. The ball of light was constantly shaking, and occasionally, some light spots would completely extinguish and disappear without a trace. This kind of disappearance wasn't after the fusion, but the kind of disappearance that was completely extinguished. After the fusion disappeared, although the light spots would disappear, the other light spots would become brighter and more dazzling because of their disappearance. The overall brightness wouldn't change much because of this. However, now that the light spots in the ball of light had disappeared, it was different. The disappearance of the light spots caused the ball of light's brightness to continuously weaken. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan instantly understood what these two balls of light represented. The stable ones were obviously the simulated chaotic layer formed by the first batch of heavens and realms that had escaped, or rather, the part of the world formed by them. And the remaining light spots that were continuously extinguishing were obviously the realms formed by the second batch of heavens and realms that had escaped. The first batch of heavens and realms had obviously reacted the fastest. In the process of escaping, they had completely severed the connection between them and the tribulation layer. They had severed the tribulation power's corrosion on them, at least for the time being. But the second batch of heavens and realms were different. Their reaction speed was too slow. When they escaped, not only did they fail to escape the tribulation power's corrosion, but they also brought the tribulation's incarnation into it and left the transportation network layer with it. Not only did they fail to escape, but they also brought the disaster with them, allowing the transportation network layer to gain a huge advantage. Therefore, it was natural to match the two with the ball of light. The stable ball of light was clearly the state where it had completely stabilized and was no longer affected by the tribulation. As for the ball of light that was growing dimmer and dimmer, it was clear that it was the manifestation of the tribulation destroying that part of the world, destroying every part and region of that world. As Luo Fan realized this, he instantly discovered that a certain area of the almost transparent tribulation layer had suddenly become no longer transparent. It had turned back into the appearance of the tribulation layer that he had seen at the beginning. And that area was none other than the simulated chaos layer formed by the second batch of heavens and realms that had left the transportation network layer. In other words, it was the location of that part of the world that was formed. At this moment, the originally transparent tribulation layer above that area became solid. Countless channels extended from it and connected to the ball of light. The power of the tribulation continued to pour into the ball of light and into all the specks of light within the ball of light. Moreover, Luo Fan could even see that the power of the tribulation was undergoing all sorts of unimaginable changes in the constantly extinguishing specks of light. The power of the tribulation poured into the other specks of light and accelerated the extinguishing speed of those specks of light. Just like that, the cycle went on, over and over again. If it weren't for the large number of specks of light in the ball of light, even if the specks of light were extinguished so quickly, there would still be a considerable number of specks of light forming the ball of light. Otherwise, the ball of light would have been completely extinguished. Faced with this situation, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. Naturally, it wasn't something to be excited about seeing the complete destruction of the world. However, now that he had confirmed his guess and discovered a way to see through the entire simulated state of chaos, it was something to be happy about. At this moment, through the changes in the ball of light in front of him, Luo Fan had already found a way to truly see through the entire simulated chaos state and identify the truth of the entire simulated chaos state. The solution was none other than to start from this level of tribulation. In the true state of chaos, no world could be free of tribulation and immeasurable except for the big world. Obviously, there couldn't be a real big world in the simulated chaos state. After all, it was only a simulation of the state of chaos, and it was Luo Fan's seventh major tribulation. Such an existence naturally couldn't surpass the true divine level. The existence of the big world was obviously a transformation that surpassed the true divine level. Luo Fan was extremely certain about this. Since there couldn't be a big world in the simulated chaos state, naturally, there couldn't be a world that surpassed the tribulation layer. In other words, in the simulated chaos state, no matter how incredible, mysterious, and wonderful the world was, it would eventually be affected by the tribulation layer and would definitely be under the monitoring of the tribulation layer. In other words, regardless of the nature of the world, regardless of whether it was strong or weak, it would inevitably be related to the tribulation layer. In this way, he only needed to pass through this tribulation level, and he would naturally be able to sense everything that existed in this simulated chaotic state. If he wanted to, he could even forcibly pull them into the transportation network layer through a similar method as before. It was naturally impossible to achieve the final goal now. However, for the previous goal, Luo Fan already had a lot of ideas. If I want to clearly see all the worlds that are related to the tribulation layer, I must first identify the way they are related to the tribulation layer. Luo Fan thought to himself and began to try to implement his idea just now. The connection between the tribulation layer and the world was very obvious, so it could only be the tribulation. And if the tribulation wanted to pour into the world, according to his previous experiences, it obviously had to build a passage that could simulate the state of chaos. Only when the passage was built could the power of the tribulation be sent into the world, and only then could the world truly fall into the tribulation. With a slight thought, the various details that he saw when the billions of worlds in the transportation network layer established a connection with the tribulation layer appeared in his mind. Billions of worlds established a connection with the tribulation layer, or rather, the tribulation layer established a connection with billions of worlds, so there must be incomparably many types of passages. It didn't dare to say that there were all types of passages, but it definitely included most of the types of worlds. Back then, Luo Fan used his identity as the controller of the transportation network to remember all the types of passages in his mind, and even had a relatively deep analysis of these passages. The reason why he could recognize the tribulation layer and could still see the blurry image of the tribulation layer at this time was one of the benefits of this deep analysis. Being able to extract such knowledge from the structure of the various passages was enough to prove how deep his understanding of the existence of the passages was. With such a deep understanding, he only needed to slightly recall at this time, and the structure of the countless possible passages had already resurfaced in the depths of his memory. In this endless world, there must be something that is currently experiencing a tribulation at this time. With this thought in mind, his eyes narrowed slightly, and his perception began to endlessly spread out through the world of laws. He constantly sensed the endless balls of light that filled the sky and the various strange worlds. Very soon, the countless balls of light and the countless worlds in his eyes began to undergo various subtle changes. The first to change was the tribulation layer. Originally, only the tribulation layer above the ball of light had solidified, and the tribulation layer that was no longer transparent had become extremely mottled. Countless opaque spots appeared out of thin air in the tribulation layer, or rather, they appeared above the endless balls of light. At a glance, it looked like there were strange shadows in the colorful balls of light and spots of light that filled the sky. After that, from those shadows, passageways that were rather familiar to Luo Fan extended out and directly inserted into the light spots. Looking at the way the light spots were constantly fluctuating, there seemed to be some strange existence that was constantly pouring into the light spots through these passageways. Many of the light spots were undergoing various subtle changes during this process. Some suddenly became stronger, some suddenly weakened, some suddenly changed color, and some suddenly extinguished. Among the endless balls of light and spots of light that filled the sky, the light spots that were not penetrated by the passageways that extended from the tribulation layer were still blurry and semi-transparent. However, the light spots and balls of light that had been penetrated by the passageways of the tribulation layer had become extremely clear. This clarity caused the light they emitted to look increasingly bright. Chapter 27:19. Along with these changes, Luo Fan felt that many things that were originally blurry, to the point where he couldn't even confirm whether they really existed or were just his imagination, had become incomparably clear at this time. He could even vaguely feel that those worlds had a subtle repulsive effect on his world of laws. Of course, this repulsive effect was many times weaker than the many repulsive effects he had felt when he had just condensed his world of laws. If he hadn't paid attention to it long ago and carefully experienced it, he might not have felt the existence of this repulsive effect at all. Perhaps it was because the worlds that he had learned from the retribution layer were in the midst of retribution. But more likely it was because the nature of these worlds didn't have much conflict with the world of laws itself. Of course, there wasn't much conflict, and it didn't mean that there was much affinity between them. In fact, the existence of these worlds might be completely unrelated to the world of laws. In other words, this should have been 2 points on 2 nearly parallel lines. There was no relationship between them, and they didn't repel each other, nor did they have any affinity with each other. Perhaps it was because of this that Luo Fan was only able to confirm their existence now. When the world of laws was just born, he didn't sense the existence of these worlds either. In fact, at this moment, the countless light spots and worlds that existed in the boundless dark sky could be said to be such worlds. Except for the 2 light clusters that were separated from the transportation network layer. The worlds in those 2 light clusters were on the same line as Luo Fan, which allowed them to have such a strong repulsive effect on Luo Fan's world of laws, which led to all the things that happened after that. Being able to sense worlds that were on completely different parallel lines was naturally a great opportunity for Luo Fan. At this time, he didn't care about anything else, and he just wholeheartedly used the perception brought by the world of laws to carefully sense the worlds that he could clearly sense and experience the various subtle repulsive effects of those worlds on the world of laws. These repulsive effects were also useful. Of course, this method of using them wasn't as violent as the repulsive effects that the worlds that had been swallowed into the transportation network layer had received. If he were to use it in such a rough manner, he probably wouldn't even be able to grasp these repelling effects. If he wanted to make use of these repelling effects, he would have to think of other ways, other methods, and more ingenious ways to carry it out. Of course, there was a precondition for this, and that was that he had to have a deep understanding of the world produced by those repelling effects in order to be able to do this. If he couldn't even understand the situation of the world, then he would only be able to use the rough methods. Immediately, Luo Fan immersed himself in the various comprehensions. Those worlds were experiencing tribulations, and the tribulations that were thrown into them were their own great tribulations. During this process, The potential of the world was stimulated, but it was completely unable to be as peaceful, natural, and stable as before. In this way, the various subtle characteristics of the world itself were continuously revealed. These subtle characteristics were contained in the countless rays of light, or rather, contained in the interaction between the light and the world. Bit by bit, they were absorbed by Luo Fan. Time passed little by little. In the sky full of stars, more and more specks of light walked out of the illusory world and turned corporeal. These were the specks of light, or rather, the world wasn't originally affected by the tribulation layer. But as time passed and the world developed, they finally triggered the tribulation, causing the tribulation layer to establish a channel with them, and the power of the tribulation layer began to pour into them. Only then did they truly enter Luo Fan's understanding, and he could truly sense them. Of course, during this process, there were also many worlds that couldn't withstand the great tribulations and were completely destroyed, vanishing without a trace. There were worlds that couldn't survive the great tribulations and were destroyed by the attacks of the great tribulations. Naturally, there were worlds that could go against the trend and directly survive the great tribulations, obtaining endless benefits from the great tribulations and causing the world to undergo all kinds of subtle transformations. Despite all these changes, the stars in the sky didn't seem calm at all. Instead, they seemed to be endlessly turbulent, and all kinds of unimaginable changes were constantly occurring. How wonderful! Although there was no way for him to directly infuse his perception into the many worlds, Luo Fan had already gained a lot by analyzing and perceiving the radiance, color, and even the various repulsive effects they emitted. He felt that his horizons had been greatly broadened. Whether it was the simulated primal chaos loading or the many worlds in the simulated primal chaos state, he had gained some new understandings. These gains naturally couldn't directly transform into his strength, but they had a pretty good effect on perfecting his world of laws, making many imperfect structures in his world of laws gradually become more perfect. Thus, some of the originally inaccurate expressions were given new and more accurate expressions. After all these changes, his view of the world had become much clearer, much more stable, and much more complete. At this moment, in the face of such changes, Luo Fan only had a satisfied look on his face. These are all from the first great tribulation of the world. In this simulated primal chaos state, there will definitely be a second great tribulation of the world, even a third, a fourth. At a certain moment, such a thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind. Evidently, he had discovered a flaw in his understanding through the comprehension over the past few days. At this moment, in the endless pitch-black worlds, the endless worlds were mostly worlds that had survived the great tribulations under his eyes. Most of the worlds had not survived the great tribulations, and some hadn't even had the time to trigger the great tribulations. In this situation, it was obvious that it couldn't be the true appearance of the chaos simulation. Or rather, the endless worlds in front of him couldn't possibly be all the worlds that existed in the chaos simulation. There was absolutely no such coincidence in this world. Since the seventh Great Tribulation was going to construct a perfect simulation of the primal chaos, it was naturally impossible for Luo Fan to be the center. It couldn't be constructed based on Luo Fan's perspective and perception, even if, in fact, this simulation of the primal chaos did exist because of him, a perfect chaos simulation. Luo Fan's world of laws obviously couldn't be the first world in the chaos simulation. Since it wasn't the first world, then the first great tribulation of the world in this world couldn't possibly be the first great tribulation of the world in this simulated state of primal chaos. There would definitely be some other worlds that had survived the first great tribulation of the world before the world of laws. Since they could survive the first great tribulation, then the second great tribulation, the third great tribulation, the fourth great tribulation, and even more great tribulations would naturally follow. But now, what Luo Fan saw were only those that had survived the first great tribulation, those that were in the process of surviving the great tribulation, and those that hadn't yet. Obviously, these worlds could only be a very, very small part of the entire chaos simulation. This proved his conjecture that what he sensed was only a small part of the truth of this simulated chaos state. However, although he knew all this, knowing something wasn't the same as knowing it. Knowing that something exists and understanding what that thing is are two completely different things. For example, if an ordinary person knew about the existence of the Big Bang, knew that there was a galaxy beyond the galaxy, and knew that there were galaxies beyond the galaxy, would he be able to build a model of the universe in his mind after knowing about it? Would he be able to recognize all these things if he was given an astronomical map? Similarly, it was the same for Luo Fan at this time. Although he knew about the existence of the many worlds and that this was only a small part of the chaos simulation, he still couldn't recognize the existence of those worlds. According to the rules of the chaos simulation, he naturally couldn't sense their existence either. Since he couldn't recognize them, he naturally wouldn't be able to sense their existence according to the rules of the chaos simulation. After thinking through all these, he naturally came up with a solution. Now that he knew about the existence of those worlds, he couldn't recognize them because he didn't understand their nature. In that case, as long as he understood their nature, he would naturally be able to recognize their existence and then sense their existence. If he wanted to understand the existence of such worlds, he would naturally have to experience them personally. In order to achieve such an outcome, the best way was, of course, to give his world of laws the ability to survive the great tribulation of heaven and earth as much as possible and reach the essence of more tribulations again and again. If his world of laws could survive the second great tribulation, he would naturally be able to understand the essence and characteristics of the worlds that had survived the second great tribulation of heaven and earth. Once he understood this, he would naturally be able to understand the many characteristics of the worlds that had survived the second great tribulation of heaven and earth in the chaos simulation, and then sense their existence. In this way, if he wanted to see the worlds that had survived the third great tribulation of heaven and earth, he would need his world of laws to survive the third great tribulation of heaven and earth. If he wanted to see the worlds that had survived the fourth great tribulation of heaven and earth, he would need his world of laws to survive the fourth great tribulation of heaven and earth. It's similar to the Tao Master's path. Thinking of this, Luo Fan couldn't help but feel a little emotional. At this time, he looked at the Tao Master's path that he had struggled for so many years and couldn't help but have some new insights. At the beginning, he had always felt that the layers of the Tao Master's path were like layers of space-time and layers of the structure of the world. But now, after understanding the simulated chaos simulation, he realized that perhaps the Tao Master's path was actually another kind of simulated chaos simulation. The layers of structure in the Tao Master's path might be the layer of structure in the simulated chaos simulation. It seemed that he had ascended between the layers of the Tao Master's path, but perhaps in fact, what he had changed was only his own understanding. Perhaps his position in the fifth layer of the Tao Master's path was not fundamentally different from the first, second, third, and fourth layers. It was just like what he had encountered in the simulated chaos simulation at this time. The changes in his own understanding naturally led to changes in everything he could see, and also led to changes in all the repulsive and attractive effects that his world of laws had received. What was the essential difference between this and the situation in the Tao Master's path? As for the things that he had learned here, they would always exist. When he had a deeper understanding, he would still be able to see the world in the previous layer. However, it was completely different in the Tao Master's path. When he entered a deeper layer, he would be completely separated from the original layer, and there would no longer be any connection between them. This difference was even simpler. If it was really the simulated chaos simulation, he only needed to make slight adjustments to achieve the same effect. If this is really the case, then there may be some new explanations for the division of a certain layer of the Tao Master's path, as well as the many places of opportunities in those worlds. All kinds of thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind, allowing him to understand everything he had experienced in the Tao Master's path from a new perspective. After a slight change of perspective, he found that all kinds of things that he had ignored before and all kinds of things that he had previously thought were not worth mentioning suddenly had new meanings and new mysteries. When I go back this time, I may have to go against the Tao Master's path again. For a moment, Luo Fan was eager to try again. He wanted to experience all the mysteries of the Tao Master's path as quickly as possible, which he had neglected. At the thought of the benefits that would be brought to him by going through it again, he couldn't help but feel a little excited. After a while, he suppressed the excitement in his heart and once again focused his attention on the endless world and the boundless sky in front of him. Fundamentally speaking, it was still in his own world of laws that he had experienced time and time again to understand the simulated chaos simulation at a deeper level. Chapter 2720. Luo Fan wanted to find a world that was ready to undergo the second tribulation among the many worlds that had just undergone the first tribulation. That was obviously just an extravagant hope. Even if it was a simulated chaotic state, it was impossible for it to completely defy the rules. It would obviously take a long time for a world to grow to the point where it could trigger the first tribulation. That world also needed to grow to the point where it could trigger the first tribulation. It was already so difficult to trigger the first tribulation of the heavens and earth. If he wanted to trigger the second tribulation of the heavens and earth, then it could only be more difficult than triggering the first tribulation of the heavens and earth, and it could not be any easier than triggering the first tribulation of the heavens and earth. In other words, after a world had passed the first tribulation, it was impossible for it to trigger the second tribulation in a short period of time. It would at least need to recover from the damage it had suffered during the first tribulation, right? After recovering from the damage, it would need time to fully absorb the benefits it had obtained from the first tribulation, right? After fully absorbing the benefits, it would need time to fully unleash its potential, right? After unleashing its potential, it would need time to continue to grow and improve, right? If this process were to continue, it would be impossible to accomplish without at least 10,000 years. Although the flow of time between the worlds was independent, they were all connected to the same tribulation level. Since they were all connected to the same tribulation level, the time needed to trigger the power of the tribulation level had to be calculated according to the time of the tribulation level. In other words, it might have been billions of years, or even trillions of years for those worlds. However, as long as the time needed to prepare for the tribulation level had not arrived, it was impossible for the worlds to encounter the tribulation of the tribulation level. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan wanted to see the tribulation power pouring into the heavens and earths that had passed the first great tribulation in a short period of time. It was obviously not something that could be done in a short period of time. Therefore, after observing the world for hundreds of years, Luo Fan could vaguely sense that the tribulation level seemed to be reacting to the world. He still did not see any world trigger the second tribulation. Naturally, it was even more impossible for him to obtain the characteristics of the worlds that had passed the second tribulation, and it was impossible for him to truly recognize their existence. Naturally, it was even more impossible for him to see the worlds that had passed the second tribulation. It seems that in the end, I can only start from my world. Luo Fan sighed inwardly. He withdrew his gaze from the sky, full of stars, and turned it back to the tribulation layer above his transportation network layer. At this moment, the tribulation level had turned from its original blurry and transparent appearance to clear up. It looked just like when he recognized the tribulation level for the first time. Seeing this, how could Luo Fan not understand that this was a sign that the tribulation level had reconnected with the transportation network level, and even with his world of laws? At this moment, the reason why he only saw that the tribulation level was no longer transparent and had become really clear, but he didn't see anything different at all, was actually very simple. It was because the way the tribulation level affected the transportation network level, and even his world of laws, was beyond his understanding. It was just like what his world of laws had encountered previously. The power of the tribulation directly penetrated the past, present, and future through the river of time, and directly manipulated the river of time to distort the fate of the world of laws. At that time, if he hadn't guessed this possibility, he wouldn't have been able to see the power of the tribulation pouring into his world of laws from the tribulation level. The situation this time wouldn't be too different from the last time. At the thought of this, Luo Fan began to raise his guard. One must know that this situation meant that he could capsize if he wasn't careful. And if he were to capsize, although he wouldn't be doomed eternally, at the very least, all his previous efforts and all the foundation he had built for this world of laws would turn into bubbles. This kind of change could be said to be closely related to his life. Compared to the various changes in the sky full of stars, it would be an understatement to say that it was 10,000 times more important. Under such circumstances, he would be a fool to still focus his attention on the sky full of stars, or rather, the boundless world. Is it my world or another world? Luo Fan thought as he swept his perception across the entire transportation network level. The remaining world in the transportation network level was still extremely calm. At least, there were no changes related to the tribulation. Those who survived the tribulation unscathed were doing their best to absorb the benefits bestowed by the tribulation level. On the other hand, those who survived the tribulation with difficulty were doing their best to recover their world and recover their state. As for those who had lost their heaven and earth and were only left with their own bodies, they had found a corner of the transportation network to open up a cave abode. They cultivated on their own, trying their best to open up their own heaven and earth. At a glance, this situation was no different from what Luo Fan had seen more than 100 years ago. After seeing this clearly, Luo Fan already understood that the changes this time were most likely happening in his world of laws. After all, he couldn't see any changes in other worlds unless they appeared in those worlds. The power of the tribulation was also beyond his range of perception, and he couldn't understand it at all for the time being. Otherwise, it would mean that those worlds weren't eroded by the tribulation. Obviously, the tribulations encountered by those worlds were something that he couldn't understand, and the possibility of this happening was relatively low. After all, the state of those worlds didn't seem like they could encounter tribulations at this time. Moreover, even if they could encounter tribulations, it was very likely that the situation was one of the two signs of tribulations that he had encountered before. Since that was the case, the second possibility was obviously more likely. Of course, even if he guessed wrong, it wouldn't be much of a loss. A thorough investigation of his own world would not bring him any loss in the morning, with all these thoughts in mind. What Luo Fan should do at this time was very obvious. At this moment, he completely locked his perception on his world of laws and carefully sensed all the abnormal changes that might occur in this world of laws. As long as the power of the tribulation took effect, there would definitely be changes. Even if the power of the tribulation directly targeted the river of time, directly affecting the past, present, and future at the same time, there would still be some signs in the process of thoroughly investigating the situation of this world. Luo Fan even summoned many cultivators in the name of the sect master and ordered them to search for the signs of the tribulation that might exist in this world. Although those cultivators didn't sense the existence of any signs of the tribulation, none of them dared to take it lightly when they heard the words signs of the tribulation. This was a tribulation. It was a terrifying existence that could cause the entire world to collapse if they weren't careful. If they couldn't find any signs, it would only be a waste of time at most. However, if they didn't find any meat, they might miss the chance to avert the calamity in the end, and this world would be completely destroyed in the end. The risk was so unequal that no matter how courageous those cultivators were, they didn't dare to take it lightly. Moreover, these words came from the sect master. Many cultivators began to disperse and mobilize their own forces. They began to carefully search for signs of the existence of the tribulation in all aspects. These cultivators were native cultivators of this world. Their degree of affinity with this world was naturally self-evident. If there were any changes in this world, the first one to discover would be Luo Fan, followed by the heavenly Tao, and then the cultivators. Moreover, because these cultivators' perspectives were completely different from Luo Fan and the heavenly Tao, there was a high possibility that these cultivators would discover things that Luo Fan couldn't discover and things that the heavenly Tao couldn't discover. For example, a giant might not be able to discover small things, but a small person could clearly find them. It was because of this that Luo Fan issued this mission at this time. Instead of relying on his own efforts to search for it, time passed slowly, and the tribulation layer above the transportation network layer became more and more obvious. As it became more and more obvious, Luo Fan gradually felt an indescribable pressure in his heart. This situation meant that the tribulation layer and the passage to the tribulation heaven and earth were becoming more and more stable, and the power of the tribulation that flowed through it was also increasing. The heaven and earth that were targeted by the tribulation layer was very likely to be his heaven and earth of laws. Under such circumstances, how could he not feel pressured when he couldn't find any signs of the existence of the tribulation at all? On this day, Luo Fan was searching everywhere, thoroughly investigating the situation in this world, and looking for signs of the tribulation. Suddenly, a cultivator came to seek an audience. This cultivator was at the top of the cultivators in this world. Although he wasn't the strongest, he was at the highest level. He was also an existence that stood at the peak of cultivation in this world. His cultivation realm was also at the pseudo-sage realm. Sensing that this cultivator had come to seek an audience, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat, and he summoned him. As soon as the cultivator saw Luo Fan, he hurriedly bowed and said, "Greetings, Sect Master. I've come to seek an audience with you because I've discovered some abnormalities, and it might be related to the signs of the tribulation. I dare not hide it from you, so I've come to inform you." Hearing this, Luo Fan was slightly shocked. He didn't expect that these cultivators would really discover the signs of the tribulation. He immediately ordered the cultivator to report the signs. The cultivator didn't dare to be negligent. After apologizing, he raised his hand and waved, bringing out a few figures and placing them in Luo Fan's palace. These figures seemed to be cultivators, but they were only at the bottom of the hierarchy. Their strength hadn't even reached the itinerant immortal realm. Not to mention to Luo Fan, even to the cultivator who came to report, they were ants among ants. At this time, Luo Fan didn't wait for the cultivator to report anything wrong. He directly used his perception to invade the cultivator's body and began to thoroughly investigate these weak cultivators. The physical conditions of these cultivators were rather normal. They were indeed living beings that were naturally born in the heaven and earth of laws that he had opened up. They were also cultivators that had cultivated according to the cultivation techniques of the heaven and earth of laws that he had imparted. However, Luo Fan wasn't surprised by this. The various conditions inside and outside the body were just a part of what these cultivators represented. At that moment, he bypassed the physical condition of these cultivators and began to investigate them from an even more mysterious and difficult angle. He thoroughly investigated the karma of these cultivators, thoroughly investigated their karma, thoroughly investigated their karmic luck, thoroughly investigated their memories, and even thoroughly investigated their existences. After a thorough investigation, he vaguely understood what was going on. Each and every one of these cultivators had gained memories that they shouldn't have. These memories caused them to become somewhat similar to their original cultivators. However, these additional memories weren't produced by any means of possession. Instead, they seemed to have appeared out of thin air, as if they had received some kind of invisible resonance. After obtaining these memories, their karma and luck seemed to have gone through some kind of chaos and became fundamentally different from before. Although it wasn't as if they had become completely different people, they had completely deviated from their original trajectory. This situation was rather familiar to Luo Fan. It was as if he had seen such a method somewhere before and discovered a similar situation. Recover the memories of their previous lives? Obtain the memories of their future lives? Or obtain the memories of their parallel selves? At this moment, all kinds of speculations appeared in Luo Fan's mind. If it was any other time, Luo Fan wouldn't have paid much attention to such an anomaly. However, at this time, when he was struggling to thoroughly investigate the tribulation and discover that the tribulation layer was using some method to target the transportation network layer, how could he not pay attention to such an obvious anomaly? How could he not link it to the tribulation? With a slight thought, he began to thoroughly investigate these cultivators from all aspects. The most basic method was naturally to directly investigate their memories. Through the various situations in their memories, he would find out where these memories came from and which of these situations they were in. Chapter 27-21. A parallel self was a parallel world, a parallel universe, a parallel heaven and earth, a parallel space, a parallel time, and a parallel dimension. According to the newly born memories of these cultivators, the living environment in their memories was somewhat similar to the current world of laws. Most of them were the same, but there was a small part that was extremely different from this world of laws. Moreover, this difference wasn't abrupt. Instead, it was natural. It was as if the world was born that way, and the one that was awkward was his world of laws. This appearance obviously couldn't be a memory of the past or the future, nor could it be a possession by someone else. It wasn't an illusory memory given by some powerhouse. Since he rejected this possibility, it could only be the memory of a parallel self. As for what kind of self this parallel self was, whether it was a parallel world, a parallel universe, a parallel heaven and earth, a parallel space, a parallel time, or a parallel dimension, this required further analysis. Once he found the root, it would be much easier to analyze the source of these memories. At the very least, it was much easier for Luo Fan. At this moment, he unfolded the abnormal memories of the cultivators in front of him bit by bit, analyzing and studying them in depth. After a while, he rejected all the wrong possibilities. Finally, he locked on to one possibility, and that was that these memories came from different parallel dimensions. In other words, the memories of their corresponding existences in other space-time dimensions. Luo Fan's current world of laws was just a normal world, and there was still a big gap between it and a perfect world. Such a world naturally couldn't be like the big world, which could collect all the dimensions, parallel universes, parallel space-time, parallel space, parallel world, and parallel time. Therefore, although the area where Luo Fan was at this time was only a world of laws, however, there were still countless worlds of laws in other dimensions. There were even countless parallel universes, parallel heaven and earth, parallel space, parallel time, and parallel space overlapping with this world of laws. Although all of this was based on the world of laws that Luo Fan was currently in, it could be said that the universe, heaven and earth, world, space-time, and dimensions derived from this world of laws existed and perished because of the existence of this world of laws. However, existence was existence. Since these parallel existences existed, then they could naturally give birth to countless kinds of living beings, which were the corresponding living beings of the world. At the same time, their existence would also affect the laws of this world. After discovering the source of these cultivators' abnormal memories, Luo Fan instantly understood where the tribulations came from to attack this world of laws. His heart stirred slightly, and his perspective began to change subtly. Although Luo Fan had always been in charge of this world of laws and had not paid attention to the many parallel universes, and parallel dimensions, it did not mean that he could only be confined to this world of laws. In fact, since all the other parallel existences were derived from the origin of the world of laws, then all of them were naturally under Luo Fan's absolute control. However, to Luo Fan, because those parallel existences were attached to the origin of the world of laws, all the changes in them would not affect any changes in the origin of the world of laws. Therefore, he did not care about those parallel existences, nor did he care about the countless possibilities of the world of laws that were derived from the origin of the world of laws. Now that he had discovered that those parallel dimensions might be targeted by the tribulations and might be used to deal with this world of laws, he could enter and investigate them with just a thought. Since he had already determined that the memories of those cultivators came from different space-time dimensions, the focus of Luo Fan's attention was naturally on those different space-time dimensions. Moreover, because he had those memories as primers, he instantly locked onto the corresponding space-time dimensions. The moment he locked onto those space-time dimensions, he instantly felt the existence of the tribulations. The power of many tribulations had already poured into those space-time dimensions, hidden between heaven and earth, ready to erupt at any time and completely overturn the entire space-time dimension. Every space-time dimension that these abnormal memories led to was the same, without any exception. Moreover, in addition to those space-time dimensions that already had abnormal memories transmitted into this world of laws, there are also many other space-time dimensions that had undergone similar changes. They were also enveloped by the power of the tribulations. After discovering this, he raised his head and looked at the tribulation layer above the transportation network layer. With this look, he discovered that many changes had taken place in the tribulation layer. Countless seemingly real and illusory channels directly extended down from the tribulation layer and directly inserted into his world of laws. Through the world of laws, they directly connected to many other space-time dimensions and continuously poured the power of the tribulations into those space-time dimensions. The scene before him made Luo Fan understand that his understanding was correct. The power of the tribulations was indeed pouring into his world of laws through other space-time dimensions. After grasping the power of the tribulations, it was obvious what to do. All of this came from other space-time dimensions. Therefore, the first thing he had to do was naturally to completely expel the power of the tribulations in those other space-time dimensions. The ending power this time was still just a sign, and it wasn't the real outbreak of the tribulations. Since it was just a sign, it would be relatively easy to deal with it. At this moment, with just a slight thought, the heavenly Daos in those space-time dimensions had already directly locked onto the power of the tribulations that had spread throughout the entire world. They began to give birth to all kinds of subtle changes that directly targeted the power of the tribulations. Behind the heavenly Daos was the entire world of laws, and that was Luo Fan. With the entire world as the source of power, it couldn't be any easier to deal with the hidden power of the tribulations. In the blink of an eye, the power of the tribulations in those space-time dimensions was expelled at the same time, and countless rays of light continuously shone in the world of laws in those space-time dimensions. All of a sudden, the living beings in those space-time dimensions felt an abnormal change. They felt that the entire world seemed to have suddenly returned to the state when the world was born and the great Tao manifested. Although the heavenly Daos controlled the power of the entire world and Luo Fan's power, the power of the tribulations still had the backing of the level of tribulations. Even if their power was limited because they were hidden, they weren't completely defenseless after all. When the heavenly Daos displayed all kinds of powers and methods to deal with the power of the tribulations, the power of the tribulations also released all kinds of incredible defensive powers to fight against the power of the heavenly Daos. This kind of confrontation would naturally cause damage to both sides, and the aftermath of this damage would leak out, forming the countless streams of light that contain the mysteries of both sides. Therefore, to all living beings, such streams of light contained endless principles and mysteries, the mysteries of the heavenly Daos, and also the mysteries of the level of tribulations. Faced with this situation, an indescribable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face, and his eyes showed a solemn look. Although the power of the tribulations was quickly dealt with by the heavenly Daos in those space-time dimensions, it didn't mean that the signs of the tribulations this time were over. In fact, this was just the beginning. The power of the tribulations was still constantly spreading, pouring into more and more space-time dimensions, infecting more and more space-time dimensions, causing Luo Fan to have to deal with more and more space-time dimensions. Moreover, in the end, the power even spread to parallel universes, parallel spaces, parallel worlds, parallel times. In other words, everything that had a parallel life form was affected. It didn't feel like it was specifically targeted at a certain real existence, such as a certain dimension, space-time, heaven, earth, or world. Instead, it felt like it was directly targeting living beings. However, this time, it wasn't directly targeting the living beings, but the environment where the living beings existed. There were simply too many places with parallel living beings. Even Luo Fan felt that it was an incredibly huge number. At this time, these were the targets of the level of tribulations, and even Luo Fan couldn't take it lightly. Therefore, even though he seemed to have gained the upper hand and seemed to have gained an absolute advantage in those space-time dimensions, he didn't feel the slightest bit relaxed. If it's really targeting parallel living beings. With this thought in mind, he raised his head and looked at the level of tribulations above the transportation network. At this time, the level of tribulations seemed to be undergoing some subtle changes, and the number of passages seemed to be increasing. However, upon closer inspection, this increase seemed to be just an illusion. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan understood what was going on. It was clear that his thoughts were already close to the truth, but his understanding didn't keep up with his thoughts, and it didn't change because of his thoughts. It didn't allow his understanding to be completely reversed, and he was able to see the passages hidden in the scope that he couldn't see. To reverse one's perception, it was only a matter of a few words, and it seemed very simple. But in reality, it was extremely difficult to achieve this goal. Even if it was Luo Fan, he would need to meet all kinds of conditions to achieve this. It wasn't something that could be achieved by hypnotizing himself to change his understanding, and at this time, the reason why Luo Fan couldn't follow his own thoughts and change his cognition was because, although he thought of the possibility that the power of those tribulations was connected to the many parallel existences because of the parallel beings, there was no evidence. Or rather, he couldn't convince himself. He couldn't understand how the level of tribulations targeted these parallel living beings, how it targeted these parallel living beings, and how it changed the environment through these parallel living beings. He couldn't convince himself, and he couldn't understand the conclusion that he had come to. Naturally, he couldn't change his understanding, and he couldn't see the countless passages that extended from the level of tribulations through this change in understanding. Knowing the crux of his problem, Luo Fan quickly took a deep breath and spread his perception to cover all the parallel existences in the world of laws. This included parallel universes, parallel space-time, parallel worlds, parallel dimensions, parallel time, and parallel space. Every single one of them was limitless. Altogether, the number of worlds that he needed to sense was even more than the number of worlds that he needed to sense when he directly sensed the river of time at each point in time. If it wasn't for the fact that Luo Fan was the creator of this world of laws, and everything was taking the initiative to respond to him, reducing the consumption of sensing the past to an unimaginable level. Just this unbelievable amount alone would have been enough to make him feel helpless. Of course, even with all these conveniences, in order to achieve his goal and complete his sensing of everything, Luo Fan still felt that his consumption had reached an unbelievable level. He would even occasionally feel that his strength was insufficient and his body would feel empty. This change lasted for a few days, and only then did Luo Fan fully incorporate everything into his perception. At this time, he felt as if he had been divided into billions and trillions of parts. He had directly turned into billions and trillions of Luo Fan, and they were thrown into the countless parallel existences. This feeling was rather peculiar. Compared to his original state, there was an essential difference, but it was also unique. It allowed him to vaguely comprehend many things that he couldn't comprehend in the past, and feel all kinds of subtle feelings that he couldn't feel in the past. Different parallel existences, no matter how similar they were to the source of the world of laws, would inevitably have some differences. These differences could be big or small, and some were enough to change the characteristics of this world, giving birth to all kinds of existences that Luo Fan couldn't imagine. Some were only slightly different, and if one wasn't careful, they wouldn't even be able to distinguish the differences between them and the source of the world. Moreover, there were all kinds of different situations. Some parallel existences were just slightly different, giving birth to completely different scenes, completely different living beings, and even completely different cultivation systems. Chapter 27-22. These various indescribable performances made Luo Fan have a different understanding of heaven and earth, of time, of fate, of dimensions, and of cause and effect. He felt as if his horizons had been widened a little once again, amidst these comprehensions, his perception brought more and more parallel existences into his senses. Finally, after an unknown period of time, he finally brought all parallel existences into his senses, allowing his existence to cover all the possibilities of this world of laws. As he brought the last bit of parallel existence into his senses, a subtle feeling suddenly emerged from the bottom of his heart. In a trance, it was as if he had suddenly transformed into the world of laws. It was as if this world of laws was his body, his heart, his soul, and the essence of his life. The power in his body, his divine abilities, his perception, and even his view of the world of laws had instantly broken through the barriers between the inside and outside of his body and completely integrated into this world of laws. What is this? Feeling this indescribable and wonderful feeling, Luo Fan's heart was filled with doubts. This kind of situation was something that he had never expected. One must know that even though he was the creator of this world of laws, he was still just a creator in the end. Although he could control this world of laws and grasp everything within it, it was only control. It was only control. This world of laws was still the world of laws, and he was still himself. At most, this world of laws had become his domain and a defensive field to protect him in this simulated state of chaos. However, he didn't feel like he had completely integrated with this world of laws. But now, it was as if he had completely integrated with this world of laws. He truly sensed everything from the perspective and perception of the world of laws. He truly had complete control over everything in this world of laws, including those that he couldn't control before. One could well imagine how novel this situation was. At this moment, Luo Fan almost forgot his original purpose and couldn't help but indulge in this inexplicable feeling. He had completely fused with the world of laws, treating the world of laws as his own body, his own heart, his own spirit, and his own life essence. This made it so that the entire world of laws no longer had any secrets in his heart. For an existence like Luo Fan, being able to sense and control his own body was already an instinct among instincts. Any existence that had reached their level would definitely have a deep understanding of themselves that had reached an unimaginable level. It was even to the extent that there were no secrets left in their bodies. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan, who had transformed this world into his body, spirit, divine soul, and life essence, naturally began to use his instincts to control his body to sense this world more deeply and dig out the secrets of this world. As he grasped and dug, an uncomfortable feeling suddenly welled up in his heart. It was an uncomfortable feeling as if he was shrouded in a dense fog and was wrapped up in it. In this kind of fog, he seemed to be tied up, and his movements were restricted in various ways. He couldn't control himself at all. This feeling was fine for a short period of time, and it could even give him a sense of stability. However, as time passed, it became very uncomfortable and oppressive. At this moment, time began to pass from a short period of time to a long period of time. In other words, he began to feel uncomfortable and oppressive. The instincts to control his body were so powerful that in an instant, he had already locked onto the existence that made him feel uncomfortable and oppressive. In other words, it was the fog that shrouded his body. It was the power of the tribulations that spread across the countless parallel existences. This time, he didn't need to distinguish it at all. He discovered that the power of the countless tribulations was entwining around his many parallel existences, directly changing the various environments in his many parallel existences. Through the changes in those environments, it began to push the changes to his source of laws, the world of laws. This looked like it was slowly and firmly changing a living being from a psychological point of view. This change was naturally insignificant at the beginning and wouldn't cause too much of a reaction. However, once the change accumulated to a certain extent, the living being would no longer be the original living being. At this moment, Luo Fan looked directly at the tribulation layer. He discovered that the originally transparent, blurry, and faintly discernible passages that extended from the tribulation layer and directly penetrated into the world of laws had become completely clear. Moreover, apart from the traces and outlines of the passages that he had seen before, he also saw countless more passages. The number of passages that were 10 times more than before. The tribulation passages. When he discovered this, Luo Fan was both relieved and shocked. He was glad that he had finally discovered the passages, and finally saw the existence of the countless dangers that he had previously overlooked. However, he was shocked that there were so many of these passages. One must know that most of these passages were passages that he couldn't understand or even imagine before. There were so many passages and so many types. This meant that he didn't understand more than 90% of the signs of the tribulations. It was easy to imagine how shocking this situation was for someone like him, who thought that he was knowledgeable and had a deep understanding of cultivation. He even thought that he had reached a certain peak. Fortunately, I got this feeling. Otherwise, I'm afraid I wouldn't even know how I died. After a long time, such a thought emerged in Luo Fan's mind. One must know that if he didn't have this feeling and the instinct brought about by fusing with the world of laws, he would have probably completely ignored 90% of the attacks. Now that he was able to discover this, it was something to be happy about no matter what. At this time, he did not directly cut off the various paths of tribulations. Instead, he began to carefully comprehend these paths of tribulations. He wanted to understand how the power of the tribulations in these paths of tribulations acted on the many parallel existences in his world of laws. He discovered that these countless passages relied on his instinct to control his body, sense his body, and explore the mysteries of his body. It could be said that although he could clearly see the existence of these passages at this moment, he only knew that they existed but didn't know why they existed. It was by relying on his body's senses and the effects of his body that he was able to confirm their existence. He himself, and his true knowledge, did not actually understand these passageways, nor did he understand how the tribulations within worked. Under such circumstances, he could naturally use his instinct to cut off these passages and expel the power of the tribulations. However, he wouldn't be able to grow or make any progress. Obviously, for Luo Fan, such an outcome wasn't what he wanted. Therefore, what he had to do at this moment was, of course, to comprehend these passages and experience the countless ways in which the power of the tribulations worked. As long as I understand this, my understanding of the simulated chaotic state will definitely deepen. He raised his head and looked up at the countless stars that were reflected in the boundless darkness. Currently, the reason why he couldn't really see those worlds clearly, or, in other words, since the existence of those worlds was actually quite simple. It was because he couldn't recognize the existence of those worlds, and he couldn't clearly sense the connection between those worlds and the levels of the tribulations. Once he understood the way in which the countless passages extended from the levels of the tribulations worked with the worlds and how they existed, he would soon be able to see the existence of many worlds that he couldn't see clearly in the past. With the existence of those passages and his clear sense of the various parallel existences of the worlds, it would be a piece of cake for him to sort out the existence, way in which those passages worked and how they worked. As time passed, more and more mysteries appeared in his heart, and the way in which those powers worked in the parallel existences kept appearing in his heart. In the parallel existences, the various changes that the power of the tribulations had on the environment were slowly imprinted in his heart. The secrets of how the power of the tribulations changed the source of the world of laws through the parallel existences, how it worked on living beings, and how it truly connected the levels of the tribulations with the world of laws began to be revealed in front of him bit by bit. Very soon, Luo Fan felt that his understanding of the levels of the tribulations had deepened. As expected, it's through living beings. Finally, he let out a long sigh. At this time, he finally obtained a true and accurate belief, and was truly sure of how the levels of the tribulations worked on his world of laws. He was truly sure that the power of the tribulations worked through the countless parallel existences of the world of laws, and that it originated from the parallel selves of the living beings in the world of laws. And this effect was through the fusion of the parallel selves, unknowingly compressing and transferring the power of the tribulations and the parallel existences into the depths of the bodies and minds of the living beings. Of course, the depths of the bodies and minds were not like the depths of the bodies and minds of the tribulations that appeared at the beginning of the first omen of the tribulations. The depths of the bodies and minds of living beings were infinite and contained infinite mysteries. Even if they were all in the depths, there were still countless kinds of them. At this time, the depths of the bodies and minds that were compressed by the power of the tribulations brought by the countless parallel cells were different from the depths of the bodies and minds in the beginning. After entering it, the tribulations would start to disperse in all directions through the living beings and gradually integrate into the source of the world of laws. In the end, when the power of the tribulations increased to a certain extent, it would completely erupt and turn into a great tribulation of the world of laws, causing the world of laws to truly fall into a great tribulation and accept the test of the levels of the tribulations. When he completely comprehended all of this, the passages of the tribulations would no longer be a secret to him. At this moment, he looked at the levels of the tribulations again and found that the situation where he couldn't control them at all and wanted to cut them apart seemed to require all of his strength had completely changed. Now, these passages had become something that could be done with a single thought. With a slight thought, he casually made a grabbing motion, and the countless passages of the tribulations that were thousands of times denser than the rain completely disappeared. At a glance, the passage between the levels of the tribulations and the transportation network had become clear again, and there were no longer any other passages. However, this time, the levels of the tribulations didn't disappear again because of this change, and instead became transparent. Instead, they still maintained their original physical appearance. It felt like there were still passages that Luo Fan didn't understand existing in the transportation network layer. What's going on? Seeing this scene, Luo Fan couldn't help but feel a little bewildered. At this moment, he seemed to have transformed into the world of laws, and everything in the world of laws was like his own body to him. His instinct to control his body allowed him to clearly discover everything that was wrong with his body. However, at this time, he didn't sense the existence of any passages of the tribulations at all. At this time, he only felt relaxed and at ease. This situation clearly showed that the world of laws had no connection with the levels of the tribulations at all. However, if there was no connection, why could he still clearly see the existence of the tribulations at this time? Normally, the tribulations should have completely disappeared by now, and only a translucent form was left. Could it be that there are still some passages of the tribulations that I don't know about? Suddenly, this thought flashed in his mind, and he couldn't help but become vigilant. If this was really the case, didn't it mean that he was still in danger? And it was a danger that he couldn't resist for the time being? Just as he was thinking about this, an indescribable passage suddenly appeared out of thin air between the tribulations and the world of laws. Endless power and energy continuously poured into the world of laws through this passage. In the blink of an eye, the world of laws was completely submerged. Chapter 27-23. The power and energy that continued to pour into the world of laws from the incomparably huge passageway that extended out from the tribulation level wasn't meant to attack or destroy the world of laws. Instead, it was meant to strengthen the world of laws and allow it to undergo another metamorphosis, allowing it to obtain a higher level of power and energy. And this clearly represented a fact. Generally speaking, in the eyes of the simulated chaos, Luo Fan's world of laws had already passed through the second great tribulation of the world. So that's how it is. Completely extinguishing all the signs and nipping all the tribulations in the bud is equivalent to completely eliminating the tribulations. As he thought of this, he faintly felt that his understanding of the tribulations and the simulated chaos had been greatly strengthened. While he was thinking about this, the power that were pouring into the world of laws began to quickly integrate into all aspects of the world of laws and began to undergo an extremely profound and fundamental transformation of all aspects of the world of laws. The volume of the world of laws began to expand rapidly during this process. The amount of heaven-earth yuan qi became denser and denser. The space became more and more stable. Time became more and more stable, and the laws became more and more profound, more and more complex, and more exquisite. Even the great Tao seemed to have received some kind of inconceivable nourishment and began to grow greatly. In addition, the endless parallel existences seemed to have decreased a lot at this time. Countless parallel existences either began to integrate with each other or began to integrate with the origin of the world of laws. All these changes felt like all the possibilities that were originally scattered were slowly converging. During this process of change, Luo Fan, who seemed to have completely integrated with the world of laws, also felt all kinds of benefits. His mind became clearer and clearer, and his understanding of cultivation, and the world of laws had unknowingly deepened. Of course, in this process, as the origin of the world of laws, and also the world of laws that Luo Fan relied on for cultivation, he also gained a lot of benefits. Of course, this benefit didn't cause the world of laws to develop in any way, and it didn't increase its volume by much. Instead, it made the world of laws more orderly, and the originally scattered concepts began to gradually be integrated. Some blanks that didn't appear before began to appear in the world after this integration. These blank spaces were the flaws in his worldview. They were the flaws that he had to make up for in order to perfect his worldview and reach the true saint level. For Luo Fan, such a change was almost a sublimation of his essence. Although these benefits did not directly fill in the blanks and did not directly complete his worldview, just highlighting the blanks was already beneficial to Luo Fan beyond imagination. Knowing where the blanks were and understanding what concepts needed to be added to the worldview was equivalent to completing the first step of perfecting the worldview. If he didn't even know what he needed to make up for and what concept he needed to add, then how could he really add an accurate concept into it? How could he understand that if he wanted to turn this worldview into a perfect level, the true saint-level worldview, he had to work hard towards? At this time, Luo Fan almost instantly threw everything else to the back of his mind and began to immerse himself in this worldview. He constantly experienced this worldview and felt the situation of the missing blanks. Through these experiences, these comprehensions, bit by bit, he struggled to make up for the blanks with his own cognition. It was obviously not an easy task to make up for these blanks. Ideas were not something that could be born just by thinking about it. They had to come from the heart and be directly dug out from the depths of one's soul. If he wanted to create a certain concept, he obviously needed to wholeheartedly agree with such a concept and wholeheartedly believe that this concept was correct in order to achieve it. If it was something else, such as a trivial fact like whether or not there was a source of rules between the heavens and the earth, Luo Fan could naturally change his own perception at will. He could easily distort his perception and think that it existed or didn't exist. However, this was only for the kind of trivial cognition that did not affect him at all. For the true cognition that involved the true worldview, Luo Fan obviously would not distort it so easily. At this time, what he needed to make up for was the blanks that belonged to the worldview. It was even related to the ultimate future of Luo Fan. It was related to whether he could become a true saint, whether he could be eternal, whether he could be immortal, and whether his countless years of struggle were meaningless. Under such circumstances, how could he easily distort his own cognition at will? Of course, he could only dig bit by bit from the depths of his soul, and sense bit by bit from his subconscious to dig out the true cognition in the depths of his heart and the thoughts in the depths of his instincts. And this was obviously a rather huge project. At this moment, Luo Fan was only grasping one of the blanks, feeling it bit by bit, digging into the depths of his heart bit by bit according to the blanks, looking for the thoughts and cognition in the depths of his heart regarding this blanks. It was not the first time for Luo Fan to experience such a thing. In fact, it could even be said that it had already become his instinct. Therefore, he was not the slightest bit rusty when it came to this kind of thing. He did it rather smoothly and without any hiccups. However, since these blanks were Luo Fan's unique worldview that still existed after so many hundreds of millions of years, it obviously proved that he did not have much of a concept about the concepts here in the depths of his heart. In other words, he had never thought about these phenomena and these facts. In this way, it was much more troublesome and difficult to dig out from the depths of his heart than to construct some concepts out of thin air. At this time, Luo Fan was completely immersed in this almost endless work. While he was immersed in the process of digging, the world of law began to undergo rounds of metamorphosis under the rewards of the tribulation level. It was obviously many times better to nip the tribulation in the bud than to overcome it when it really erupted. Therefore, even though the world of laws did not suffer any damage because of this, the power that the world of laws obtained as a reward was thousands of times more than when it passed through the tribulation normally. It was as if the tribulation level had completely converted the power of the tribulation that was originally going to pour into the world of laws into the reward here. Originally, the world of laws could already be considered a colossus compared to the other worlds in the transportation network level. It was like a sun. Now, with the endless power of the tribulation, the world of laws began to become stronger and more dazzling. All aspects of it had also grown at an unbelievable rate. Originally, it looked like a sun. Now it looked like a galaxy, or rather a river system. Among them, the countless stars in the river system were the countless parallel existences of the world of laws. This included parallel heaven and earth, parallel world, parallel space-time, parallel space, and even countless other parallel dimensions. Indifferently, what was truly displayed was only an insignificant small part of it. Moreover, what all living beings could see was only an image. In fact, they might even think that it was just their own illusion. It would be impossible for him to step into it. Faced with such a situation, many of the world founders in the transportation network level found it difficult to understand. To many of the world founders, the changes in the world of laws where Luo Fan was located were too strange and unimaginable. They could not see the existence of the tribulation level. To them, this simulated state of chaos was still the same as when Luo Fan had not realized the tribulation level and the existence of the other worlds. In other words, in the entire simulated state of chaos, only the transportation network level and the hundreds of worlds within it existed. Everything seemed so lonely. As for the arrival of the tribulation, they could not sense the tribulation level at all. Instead, they could only sense that the power of the tribulation had descended from the simulated state of chaos and attacked and destroyed their worlds. After that, the process of them overcoming the tribulation was completely by withstanding the attacks and destruction of the tribulation. As for the reward of the tribulation, it was completely out of thin air. Under such circumstances, the changes in Luo Fan's world of laws were even more incomprehensible to them. They had clearly overcome a tribulation and undergone a metamorphosis before, so why did the world of laws undergo another metamorphosis in such a short period of time? Moreover, it seemed like the metamorphosis this time was even more profound, and the changes were even greater than before. Previously, it was just a quantitative change. It was just that its mass had become larger, and its various aspects had become stronger than before. Everything was still within the scope of their understanding. However, the metamorphosis this time was completely beyond their understanding. Why did the world of laws turn into a river system? Why did the volume suddenly increase so much? Why did the transportation network level seem to be unable to withstand its existence? All of this was an incomprehensible change for the many world founders. They looked at each other in dismay and had no idea what was going on. Could this be the true metamorphosis after overcoming the first tribulation? What happened before was just a preparation. In the end, a world founder said, no matter how they thought about it, this situation seemed to be the only one that could explain the current changes in Luo Fan's world of laws. Naturally, not all the world founders agreed with such an explanation. Another world founder said, perhaps he has already overcome the second tribulation. After all, the flow of time in the various worlds is independent of each other, and does not affect each other. Perhaps hundreds of trillions of years have passed in this world of laws. Originally, many of the world founders were immersed in their own world of laws and their own cultivation. But now, as the changes in the world of laws grew greater and greater, more and more world founders were attracted to it. They couldn't help but detach themselves from their own tasks and began to focus their attention on the world of laws. With this change, naturally, more and more world founders began to participate in this discussion. All sorts of possibilities were raised by them and denied by them. As world founders, each and every one of them was in existence with an incomparably firm mind. It was obviously extremely difficult to reverse their understanding and make them admit the possibility that they originally denied. Without absolute evidence, it was clear that not many founders of the world could do this. Therefore, in the end, when the transformation of the world of laws was over and the entire world of laws had turned into a huge galaxy that seemed to have occupied most of the area of the transportation network layer, the world's founders still insisted on their own opinions, and no one could convince the others. However, as the world of laws metamorphosis gradually stabilized, the world founders also gradually calmed down. After all, the world of laws metamorphosis was ultimately just the world of laws metamorphosis. Luo Fan might be able to gain great benefits from it, but to them, it was just a show to watch. The only thing that could benefit them was the metamorphosis of their own world of laws. At this moment, seeing that the transformation of the world of laws was complete and the situation in the transportation network layer had truly stabilized and could no longer affect them, they began to shift their attention back to their own world of laws. In fact, some pioneers even gained some new comprehension in the process and began to re-establish their own world, establishing a foundation for their existence in this simulated state of chaos. Chapter 27-24. Luo Fan obviously did not care about the bewilderment and uncertainty of the other world founders. At this moment, he was just immersed in sorting out his own worldview, working hard to dig out his own mind, and experiencing the concepts and thoughts in the depths of his heart about various things and phenomena. Through these experiences, he slowly constructed all kinds of cognition of things and phenomena that he had never thought of before, and he slowly filled in the blanks in his worldview. This process sounded simple, but in fact, it was very complicated, and it was even more complicated than sorting out his worldview. It was thousands of times more difficult. Back then, Luo Fan spent millions of years to build the embryonic form of his worldview. After that, he spent trillions of years on this embryonic form of the night to reach this step. Now, his actions were equivalent to building a new system on top of the flaws that he couldn't find after spending trillions of years. He was building a new system that could make up for the original worldview. The difficulty of such a task was self-evident. It could be said that if he didn't have the blank space as a guide, he wouldn't have been able to do it. However, even with the blank space as a guide, it was still a huge project to achieve this. At this moment, all he could do was grind bit by bit, find out the most secret thoughts hidden in the depths of his heart, and extract the deepest cognition bit by bit. After that, he would use all kinds of strictest methods to torture these thoughts and test these cognition. After going through this for God knows how many times, he could barely form the embryonic form of cognition, the embryonic form of concepts. After that, whether this embryonic form could grow and adapt to the worldview would depend on luck. Once he adapted, it would naturally be for the best. However, once he couldn't adapt, he would have to adjust these concepts or adjust his worldview. This would be another round of grinding and experiments. Just thinking about it was enough to make anyone feel hopeless. But this time, Luo Fan had no choice. As long as he wanted to obtain the most perfect view of the world, to become a true sage, to be immortal, and to be impervious to all tribulations, then he could only grind it bit by bit, experiment by experiment, overturn the conclusions he had established over and over again, and change his confirmed cognition over and over again. Under such circumstances, time passed bit by bit. Unknowingly, 30 million years had passed in the world of laws. For the outside world, or rather, for the transportation network layer, 30 million years was only equivalent to 3,000 years. Although this period of time was not too short, compared to the time that Luo Fan had experienced, it was already unimaginably fast. In these 3,000 years, many worlds in the transportation network layer had unknowingly encountered the signs of the second Great Tribulation of the world. Compared to Luo Fan, who could discover this struggle through various methods, erase the signs, and nip the calamity in the bud, the other worlds in the transportation network layer did not have such an ability. During this process, not a single world, or rather, not a single creator of the world, could detect the existence of such a sign. For them, during these 3,000 years, their world had been extremely smooth and peaceful. Everything was exactly the same as the world they had dreamed of. Of course, it was 3,000 years for the transportation network layer, but the time inside their world was not necessarily the same. Some worlds had already experienced more than 30 million years in the world of laws, while some had even experienced less than 300 years. As for how much time had passed, it depended on the interaction between the world and the transportation network layer, as well as the will of the creator of the world. Just like Luo Fan's world of laws, the reason why 3,000 years had passed in the transportation network layer was that more than 30 million years had passed in the world of laws was because Luo Fan had a sense of urgency. Because he knew that it would take a huge amount of time to make up for the blanks in the world of laws. It was because of this sense of urgency, and because he knew that this task required a huge amount of time, that he instinctively wanted to obtain more time. Because of this instinctive need, the time in the world of laws was about 10,000 times faster than the outside world. Only 3,000 years had passed in the outside world, but 30 million years had passed in the world of laws. But it was different for the other worlds. Some of the creators of the other worlds had a stronger sense of urgency about their own situation, while some had completely relaxed. With a stronger sense of urgency, the flow of time in their world would naturally be faster, allowing them to obtain more time. And for those who had completely relaxed, the flow of time would naturally slow down. After all, they no longer needed time at all. All they needed to do was wait. Since that was the case, time naturally wouldn't accelerate, but would instead slow down. Many of the creators were more or less aware of this situation. Of course, they were only aware of it. They still couldn't figure out the specific pattern. However, this was enough for them to split into different groups. The creators who didn't have a sense of urgency gathered together and formed a group. The creators who had a sense of urgency gathered together and formed a group. For them, companions with a sense of urgency might have a different sense of urgency, but it represented the uneasiness in each other's hearts and their vigilance for the future. On the other hand, companions without a sense of urgency were optimistic about the future, indicating that they, like themselves, didn't think that the future would be dangerous. This division could be said to be the most intuitive and unconcealable division. In the end, the groups of creators that were divided also discovered that they were indeed the same kind and had the most similar thoughts to themselves. For a time, there was more communication. Everything in the transportation network layer was constructed based on cognition. Even the positions of the worlds were the same. As their communication with each other began to separate, and the degree of recognition they had for the other worlds began to differ, the positions of the many worlds in the transportation network layer also began to change. The worlds that had a faster flow of time began to gather together, while the worlds that had a slower flow of time gradually gathered together. In the end, the entire transportation network layer was naturally divided into regions. Of course, the creator of the world's thoughts were constantly changing. Some of the creators still felt a strong sense of urgency at this moment, but in the next moment, they might relax. On the other hand, some of the creators might still be relaxed at this moment, but who knew when they would wake up and suddenly feel a sense of urgency. Under such constant changes, the many worlds in the transportation network layer were simply like caravans that were constantly moving. This caused the transportation network layer to completely lose its original sense of stability. Instead, it became lively. Of course, all these changes did not include Luo Fan's world of laws. No matter how the positions of the many worlds in the transportation network layer changed, Luo Fan's world of laws was the absolute core of the transportation network layer, as the absolute central existence that suppressed the entire transportation network layer. Of course, due to the speed of time in this world of laws, the worlds that were closest to this world of laws generally had a faster flow of time. The further one was from this world of laws, the slower the flow of time would be. In the end, even the time in the transportation network layer flowed thousands of times slower. Compared to the ever-changing changes in the transportation network layer, the situation in the sky, full of stars, or rather, in the other endless worlds that the creators couldn't see, was completely different. The worlds in the transportation network layer were constantly changing, and their positions were constantly changing. However, in the boundless darkness, the changes between the endless worlds were completely different. Or rather, in the past 3,000 years, there were no obvious changes in the worlds that filled the sky. The worlds were still the same, and even the positions of the light spots had not changed at all. Apart from the fact that some worlds had disappeared due to the attacks of the tribulation layer, the worlds in the simulated state of chaos were relatively independent of each other. The flow of time between them was also relatively independent. There is a common standard between the many worlds in the transportation network layer, and that was because the transportation network layer linked all the worlds together. It was precisely because of the existence of the transportation network layer that the flow of time between the worlds would follow a fundamental rule. It was also because of the existence of the transportation network layer that the flow of time between the worlds would follow a fundamental rule. It was also because of the difference in the flow of time between the worlds that these worlds would start to shift positions. Of course, even with the existence of the transportation network layer, the flow of time between these worlds was still independent of each other. From this, it could be seen how independent the various worlds were in this simulated primal chaos state. Compared to the situation of the transportation network layer connecting the worlds together, the other worlds that filled the sky, or rather, the entire simulated state of chaos, were different. For those worlds, their independence from each other was countless times stronger than the independence of the many worlds in the transportation network layer. Behind those worlds, there wasn't a single fundamental law controlling all of this. For the transportation network layer, 3,000 years had passed. However, for the many worlds, the time that had passed might not even be 3 breaths of time, and it might even be the other way around. Under such circumstances, the endless worlds that were originally imprinted in the transportation network layer were actually the most ordinary and normal appearance of the endless worlds. In other words, no matter how many tens of thousands of years or hundreds of millions of years passed, as long as one's cognition didn't change, the endless worlds that one saw would still be the same. Since this was the case, the worlds that filled the sky that one saw from the transportation network layer would naturally not change. Of course, all of this could only be seen by Luo Fan, who could recognize the existence of the worlds that filled the sky. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan wasn't in the mood to check the situation of the worlds that filled the sky at this time. At this time, he was still working hard to fill in the blanks in his worldview. On this day, more than 30 million years after he started this incomparably complicated work, his heart finally trembled. He felt that he had just barely filled in the last blank space. I've finally completed the first step. At this moment, he let out a long breath. As he exhaled, the flow of time in his world of laws began to slow down rapidly. From the original 10,000 times flow of time in the transportation network layer, it gradually slowed down to the same extent as the flow of time in the transportation network layer. After all, the flow of time in the transportation network layer was originally set according to the flow of time in the world of laws. Previously, the flow of time in the world of laws was tens of thousands of times faster than the flow of time in the transportation network layer. That was actually because Luo Fan's mind was out of balance, and it was a manifestation of his own urgency that was tens of thousands of times stronger than before. Now that he had completed the initial filling in the blanks, his mentality finally recovered. It was precisely because of this that the flow of time in his world of laws returned to normal, and it was now the same as the flow of time in the transportation network layer. However, Now that he had completed filling in the blanks, it didn't mean that he had completely made his worldview of laws complete and flawless. In fact, this kind of filling was only the most preliminary and barely made up for it. In other words, it was equivalent to directly pasting a piece of rag on the hole in the clothes after it was torn and sewing it up. This method could indeed make the hole disappear and make the clothes slightly more complete. However, the hole was still extremely obvious, and it still looked like a beggar's attire. Chapter 27-25. Wearing such clothes could indeed keep one warm and satisfy one's basic survival needs. However, there is no need to even think about a higher level requirement. At this moment, Luo Fan filled in the blanks, which was equivalent to sewing a shirt full of holes with pieces of tattered cloth with a needle and thread. It could only be said to make the blanks disappear, but it was far from perfectly mending the shirt. If one wanted to mend this piece of clothing, apart from completely remaking it, the only way was to reconnect every thread of the fabric that was originally suitable for the size, shape, and material of the hole bit by bit, until the piece of clothing was as clean as new. Only then would it be considered a success. Compared to using pieces of rags to stitch up the holes, this was obviously countless times more difficult. This was also what Luo Fan needed to do next. In other words, although he had filled in the blanks, the concepts that he had filled in were actually not on the same level as the concepts in his original worldview. This kind of compensation could only be regarded as a choice at most. He needed to polish, improve, and perfect it bit by bit in the endless years that followed, overturn it again and again, and finally make the concepts and cognition that were filled in the blanks truly integrate into his worldview and become a part of it. Just thinking about it made one realize how huge of a project it was. However, for such a project, Luo Fan's heart was filled with joy. After all, even though the project was huge, he still found the direction and knew which path to take. What he needed to do next was to follow the path and start moving forward step by step. This was already many times better than the situation where he couldn't find his direction at all and even thought that his worldview was already perfect. As for time, it was not a problem for him at all. For him, time was already something that he could manipulate at will. As long as he was willing, he could compress 100 trillion years into an instant with just a thought. Of course, he did not do this at this time, but it was not because he was bored with cultivation or tidying up his worldview. Instead, it was because there was no longer any meaning in going into seclusion like before. It was like building a car behind closed doors. If one had never seen a car before, no matter how hard one worked, the car would definitely be nondescript. At this moment, his understanding of the world of laws had reached such a level. In other words, his understanding of concepts and all things in the world had been exhausted. If he continued to go into seclusion and dig deep into his heart, what he would obtain would only be the results of his imagination. Such a situation was naturally meaningless to him. Therefore, even though he knew that he could obtain endless time with just a thought, he did not use this endless time to continue cultivating in seclusion and dig into his heart. Since he had exhausted all of his resources in this area, he had no choice but to come out of seclusion. Therefore, what he needed to do next was very obvious. Of course, it was to once again accumulate their foundation. On the other hand, accumulating one's foundation clearly meant seeing more of the world, seeing more of the truth of the simulated state of primal chaos, and even more tribulations. With a thought, Luo Fan swept his perception towards the transportation network layer. In an instant, the changes in the transportation network layer over the years were imprinted in his eyes, and he could not help but sigh inwardly. He had actually guessed the different choices of the world founders a long time ago. After all, different world founders had different understandings of the simulated state of primal chaos, the self, the world, and the transportation network layer. To them, the world in their eyes and the simulated state of primal chaos were what they understood. The simulated state of primal chaos that was full of danger in Luo Fan's eyes might be more dangerous or more stable in their eyes. This different understanding made their views different at this time, and also caused the flow of time in their world to be different at this time. In turn, it affected their position in the transportation network layer. To the many world founders, the transportation network layer was extremely calm at this time. However, Luo Fan only needed a glance to know that the various signs of tribulations had descended on the transportation network layer at this time. Of course, the signs of the tribulation were extremely vague. To the heavens and earth, the struggles were still hidden and hadn't been fully aroused. It was precisely because of this that the world founders did not discover the hidden power. From many signs of tribulations, Luo Fan could see all kinds of signs of tribulations that he had encountered before. He could also see all kinds of signs of tribulations that he had not encountered before, but he could directly guess. In Luo Fan's eyes, the entire transportation network layer was currently enveloped in countless passages of tribulations that resembled raindrops. If it was not for the fact that he could accurately distinguish his vision might have been obscured, and it would have been difficult for him to clearly see the situation in the other worlds in the transportation network layer. Shaking his head, he did not pay much attention to those worlds. No matter what he said, as long as he did not have absolute evidence to prove the existence of the passages of tribulations, the world founders would not be able to recognize these things. Once they could not recognize these things, it would be useless even if they believed in Luo Fan's words. They would not be able to change the outcome of the tribulations that were constantly being injected with the power of the tribulations. Therefore, at this time, even if Luo Fan explained their current situation to them, it would only bring about a waste of his breath. It was precisely because of this that he chose to keep his mouth shut and pretend that he did not see what was happening in the transportation network layer. When the boundless pitch-black sky entered his eyes, Luo Fan could not help but take a deep breath. At this time, the entire sky was several times livelier than what he had seen before. Countless new stars appeared in front of him. In other words, countless new worlds appeared in his perception with the help of the world of laws. This was not only because of the sublimation of his perception brought about by his near-complete integration with the world of laws, but also because he had a deep understanding of the worlds that had passed through the Second Great Tribulation. He finally truly recognized the existence of the worlds that had passed through the Second Great Tribulation, allowing him to finally see the many worlds that had passed through the Second Great Tribulation. His perception was enhanced, and the increase in the worlds that he could sense and the increase in the worlds that had passed through the Second Great Tribulation combined to make the sky in front of him several times livelier than before. Moreover, compared to before, there were many blurry and indistinct stars in the sky. Perhaps it could be said that the world had become extremely clear. Among them, he could even see layers of shadows appearing behind those worlds. Those shadows were naturally the areas that corresponded to those worlds in the tribulation layer. Moreover, with his perception, he could easily sense that there were countless passages connecting to the heavens and earth in the tribulation level. It felt like there were some tiny shadows constantly spreading out from the shadows and connecting to the main body of the stars. These were obviously the signs of the tribulations that were being injected into those worlds by the various tribulations that were happening to them. The appearance of any tribulation would have signs. It was the same for the First Great Tribulation. The reason why Luo Fan didn't notice the appearance of such signs before the First Great Tribulation of the world in his world of laws was not only because the descent of the tribulation wasn't a normal method, but also because he didn't have the concept of the appearance of the signs of the tribulation before that. He only knew about the existence of the Great Tribulation in this simulated state of chaos after passing through the First Great Tribulation. It was also after that that he learned that there were various signs of the arrival of the tribulation before the arrival of the tribulation. Under such circumstances, how could he discover the signs of the first tribulation of heaven and earth? If even Luo Fan could not notice it, it was even more impossible for other cultivators and creators of the world to notice it. Originally, when Luo Fan discovered the signs of the first great tribulation of heaven and earth, it was actually impossible for him to see all the signs of the tribulation clearly. After all, there were thousands of signs of the tribulation. Who knew what the signs of the tribulation in that world would be like? What were the signs of the tribulation directed at that world? Was it a certain law of the world, a certain power of the world, a certain inheritance of the world, or even a seemingly ordinary shape of the world? However, when Luo Fan was looking at the signs of the Second Great Tribulation, he managed to achieve a state of complete unity with the world of laws through various means. Through this state, he could thoroughly investigate the signs of the Second Great Tribulation of heaven and earth, regardless of whether it was something he had thought of before or not. With this convenience, his understanding of the omens of tribulations had taken an unbelievable leap. In the blink of an eye, his understanding of the signs of the First Great Tribulation had already surpassed his previous understanding by countless times. With this foundation, when he looked at the signs of the First Great Tribulation again, he felt like a university student looking at elementary school mathematics. It was truly clear at a glance. In an instant, the signs of the First Great Calamity of the world could be clearly seen, and it was clear as day. It was precisely because of this that in this boundless world, there was not a single world that had not passed the First Great Tribulation that could not escape his senses and hide out of his sight. Of course, this was clearly only what he knew at the moment. Ever since he was slapped in the face time and time again, he was constantly doubtful about the situation in the simulated chaotic state. He constantly estimated that there were more mysteries and deeper secrets hidden in this world. Of course, no matter what he thought in the depths of his heart, what he discovered at this moment was already enough to satisfy him. Apart from the First Great Tribulation, although he did not dare to say that he completely understood the signs of the Second Great Tribulation, he already knew most of it. Therefore, the worlds that he saw at this time had passed the Second Great Tribulation of the heavens and earth, or were undergoing the Second Great Tribulation of the heavens and earth, although he dared not say that they were complete. However, he was also confident that these were definitely the majority of the worlds that had passed the Second Great Tribulation or were in the process of passing the Second Great Tribulation. With the addition of these countless worlds, the atmosphere in the simulated chaotic state had undergone a huge change. The positions of the worlds that had passed the Second Great Tribulation were clearly completely different from those that had passed the First Great Tribulation in the various worlds, or rather, in the entire simulated chaotic state. They seemed to have become the cores of the regions, the cores of the worlds that had passed the First Great Tribulation or had yet to pass the First Great Tribulation. The core meant that the worlds that had passed the Second Great Tribulation were like the center of a galaxy, surrounded by many other worlds that had yet to pass the Second Great Tribulation. To those worlds, the other worlds that had yet to pass the Second Great Tribulation were like their underlings, their subordinates, and the cannon fodder around them. Vaguely, the countless worlds that had passed the Second Great Tribulation seemed to be using their own essence to influence the other worlds that had yet to reach this level. The result of this influence was that the worlds themselves seemed to be faintly forming a simulated chaotic layer. Their positions were much closer to each other than the other worlds that had passed the Second Great Tribulation. Of course, this was also because their natures were similar. At this moment, looking at the worlds that filled the sky, Luo Fan began to imagine all sorts of subtle things in his heart. The countless blank spaces, or rather, pitch-black spaces, might be hiding worlds that had gone through more worldly tribulations. Perhaps, just like the worlds that had gone through the Second Worldly Tribulation, they had a great influence on the worlds that had not gone through as many worldly tribulations as they did. Or perhaps, it was also where their core was. If that was the case, wouldn't all the worlds be unified under a certain indescribable core? Or was it a world that was affected by a fixed core? Chapter 27-26. At the thought of this, Luo Fan couldn't help but shiver inwardly. If the entire simulated state of chaos really had such a pyramid-like structure, then it was almost certain that the current situation of his world of laws was definitely more dangerous than he had imagined. Perhaps at this very moment, there was a world that had already gone through 3, 4, 8, or even 9 great tribulations of the world that he couldn't see was affecting his world of laws through various hidden means, even distorting his world of laws. As he experienced this, there seemed to be some kind of indescribable pressure acting on the transportation network layer, on his world of laws, and on himself. Obviously, with this realization, he suddenly faintly sensed something that he couldn't sense before. It seems that this simulated state of chaos isn't a good place. This thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind at this moment. However, he soon burst out laughing. How did this simulated state of chaos come about? Although this simulated state of chaos was vast and boundless, containing endless principles and mysteries, it contained countless characteristics of the state of chaos. In essence, it was still produced by Luo Fan's seventh Great Tribulation. It could be said that, fundamentally speaking, it was a test for Luo Fan. Everything that existed here was for him to challenge, to create danger for him, and even to destroy him. Under such circumstances, it was normal for there to be all kinds of dangers here. On the contrary, the rather peaceful situation before, where as long as he didn't court death, there wouldn't be any danger, was a little unreasonable. With this adjustment of his mentality, he suddenly felt that the pressure he breathed in seemed to have decreased a lot. At the very least, it wasn't as uncomfortable as it was before. Let me see if that pyramid is real, and if there's really a world that's affecting me. At this moment, this thought emerged in his mind. Immediately, he began to shrink his perception, or rather, the perception brought about by his world of laws, all the way until it was within his world of laws, not leaking out at all. Under such circumstances, the boundless heavens and earth had completely disappeared in his eyes. Apart from his world of laws, the other heavens and earth had turned pitch black and couldn't be found any longer. The influence will definitely affect the interior of the world of laws. Moreover, it will definitely be an extremely fundamental impression. Will it target the heavenly Tao laws, grand Taos, or nothingness? With this in mind, he started to thoroughly investigate his world of laws from all aspects, experiencing the various subtle structures of this world of laws. He also observed the possible existence of external forces and the influence of external concepts. This process wasn't simple, but wasn't too profound either. It was nothing more than a fundamental comparison between every aspect of this world and his view of the world. This was indeed a rather troublesome process. It required him to expend an endless amount of energy and time to accomplish it. But in reality, that was the only thing that mattered in theory. For Luo Fan, time was something that he could obtain with just a thought. Therefore, he quickly became completely immersed in it at this moment. As he immersed himself in this process, the flow of time in this world of laws began to differ from the flow of time in the transportation network layer in the outside world. And this time, because of the existence of the threat that threatened his existence, Luo Fan's urgency was far stronger than when he was trying to fill in the blanks in his view of the world. Therefore, at this moment, the difference between the flow of time in this world of laws and the flow of time in the transportation network layer was almost countless times greater than before. Originally, it was only 10,000 times faster than the outside world. But this time, the multiplier had already reached the level of hundreds of millions at the beginning. Moreover, as he became more and more anxious, the multiplier continued to increase. In the end, it even reached the point where only a few breaths had passed in the outside world, but tens of millions of years had passed inside. During this process, the time in the outside world began to pass slowly. Unknowingly, more than 100 years had passed. After more than 100 years of development, the signs of the tribulations in the transportation network layer had finally brewed to their limits and completely erupted, drowning the entire world. Because they hadn't discovered the signs of the tribulations early on, the signs of the tribulations could be used in the most perfect way. Therefore, the worlds that were waiting for the signs of the tribulations to erupt to their limits instantly stepped into the worst direction and fell into the abyss of destruction. For the time being, although none of the worlds had completely collapsed due to the destruction of the tribulations, it was clearly only a matter of time. When the power of the tribulation reached its limit, these worlds would be completely destroyed, just like the worlds that had been destroyed in the first great tribulation of the world. They would be completely annihilated. At that time, Whether the creators of the worlds could survive would depend on their reaction speed and decisiveness. If their reaction speed and decisiveness weren't fast enough, what awaited them would probably be the same outcome as the worlds. Facing such a situation, the creators of the world that were originally extremely leisurely woke up as if they had just woken up from a dream. The worlds that had slowed down to a certain limit began to accelerate rapidly. Now, even the worlds that had the slowest time flow had reached a speed that was hundreds of times faster than the transportation network layer. As for the worlds that were already in the midst of the tribulations and were on the verge of collapse, the speed of time had already accelerated to a level that was comparable to Luo Fan's world of laws. This situation seemed unbelievable. Originally, the worlds that didn't encounter the tribulations should have needed more time to prepare for the tribulations, while the worlds that encountered the tribulations should have needed a slower flow of time to lengthen the time of the tribulations. But the truth was the complete opposite. The worlds that didn't encounter the tribulations had a slower flow of time, so they didn't have enough time to prepare for the tribulations. On the other hand, the worlds that encountered the tribulations had an unimaginably fast flow of time, and the time they had to face the tribulations was constantly decreasing. Of course, all of this was relative to the time in the transportation network layer in the outside world. The reason for this was actually very simple. It was because the mood of the creators of the worlds clearly couldn't really be as free as they wanted. As creators of the worlds, they could indeed control and influence their hearts so that they could immerse themselves in certain emotions that they needed. But that could only reach the surface. In other words, they might be able to control their own emotions and make them appear to be in a corresponding state on the surface, such as leisurely, anxious, fearful, joyful, and so on. But deep in their hearts and subconscious, their emotions were closely related to the environment they were in, and this connection was completely impossible to sever. No matter how strong one's controllability was, no matter how perfect one's emotional manipulation was, it was impossible to completely distort the emotions produced by the environment deep in one's heart and subconscious. When the environment was bad, one's mood would be anxious. When the environment wasn't so bad, one's mood would be at ease. Clearly, in the tribulations, the creators of the worlds would feel an indescribable sense of urgency in their subconscious as they watched their worlds crumble under the power of the tribulations. And the emergence of this sense of urgency would naturally accelerate the flow of time in their worlds. The stronger the sense of urgency, the faster the flow of time would be. On the other hand, the subconscious of the creators of the worlds that hadn't encountered the tribulations was clearly the opposite. As a result, the scene before his eyes had appeared. The flow of time that should have been slowing down was instead speeding up. On the other hand, the worlds that should have had more time to prepare had their time restricted within a certain range. However, the creators of the worlds clearly didn't care much about all of this. At this moment, the creators of the worlds had clearly focused their attention on their own worlds, on the tribulations that might appear and had already appeared. They naturally wouldn't care about the situation in other worlds. Since they didn't care about the situation in other worlds, they naturally wouldn't care about the difference between the flow of time in their own worlds and the outside world. Finally, on a certain day, a few hundred years later, the world that had encountered the second great tribulation of the heavens and earth was finally unable to withstand the great tribulation of the heavens and earth. The world collapsed with a loud bang, and an unimaginable impact was released towards the entire transportation network layer. Fortunately, the creator of the world was decisive enough. At the last moment, he made a prompt decision and abandoned the world. He directly broke away from the world and flew out, escaping at the last moment and avoiding the fate of being destroyed along with the world. In the end, I still failed. The creator of the world had an extremely grave expression as he looked at the gradually disappearing blank space that was completely devoured by the simulated chaos. The pain in his heart was self-evident. Even though he could split the heavens and the earth apart once more and build another world, that world would have to start from scratch again. All the effort that he had put into his world had gone up in smoke, and he would have to start all over again. If this had happened during the first tribulation of the heavens and earth, it would have been fine. After all, it was only the first tribulation of the heavens and earth. Although this meant that the heavens and earth existed for a shorter time, it meant that the heavens and earth were weaker. But at the same time, it also meant that the loss of his efforts was not that great. Right now, his world had already passed through the first great tribulation of the heavens and earth, and it had even endured through the second great tribulation for so many years. But in the end, it still collapsed and was completely erased. Just thinking about how much effort he had spent and how much effort he had put in made him feel heartache. After a while, he finally had the mood to observe his surroundings. At this moment, there was no longer a creator of the universe like him who had lost his world in the transportation network layer. The world creators who had lost their world had clearly re-established their world and found a place to live again in that period of time. At this moment, the world was also attached to the transportation network layer, turning into the nodes of the transportation network layer. Looking at those worlds, the creator of this world seemed to be deep in thought. He directly headed towards a certain world. He intended to exchange experiences with those world creators. No matter what, he had experienced the second tribulation of the heavens and earth. Compared to the world creators who had failed the first tribulation of the heavens and earth, he clearly had a psychological advantage. Furthermore, many of his experiences were clearly useful to the world creators. Clearly, the creators of the world were not completely useless to him. At the very least, they had re-established their world and attached themselves to the transportation network layer. The experience of re-establishing a world was clearly what he needed. In this way, there was clearly room for them to communicate. Both of them had the experience and knowledge that the other party wanted, so there was naturally a possibility for them to exchange. And such an exchange was clearly a good thing for both of them. The world creators were extremely welcoming towards the arrival of the world creators. It was so much so that even those worlds that weren't chosen by the creator of this world had taken the initiative to welcome the creator of this world. Very soon, many of the founders of the world gathered in the target world they had chosen. It was a rare event for them to hold a Tao discussion. The Tao discussion conference was naturally rather lively. The world creators who had lost their world during the second great tribulation of the heavens and earth clearly had the highest status in this Tao discussion conference. The other world creators who still had their own worlds surrounded him and constantly asked him for advice on things to pay attention to during the great tribulation of the heavens and earth, as well as some preparations that needed to be made after the great tribulation of the heavens and earth, as well as some problems that might occur during the second great tribulation of the heavens and earth. Chapter 27:27. After all, for the first great tribulation, these world founders were the ones who succeeded. But for the second great tribulation, the world founders were the ones who failed. The world founders were naturally interested in the experiences of those who succeeded, but they were doubtful of the experiences of those who failed. The heaven and earth founder naturally understood the attitudes of the world founders. Although they were unhappy, they could only admit that it was natural for them to do so. After all, failure was failure. The experiences of those who failed were not something that they cared too much about. Others might not care about it, but it wasn't surprising at all. There must be something that we've overlooked. In the end, one of the world founders spoke. As he spoke, he turned his gaze to the core of the transportation network, where the world was located. At this moment, the world was still a nebula in their eyes, and there were still countless other branches in the world. Over the years, many world founders had many guesses about the various changes in the world. In the end, even though none of the guesses pointed to the truth, as the founders of the world racked their brains, some of them managed to come up with some plausible answers. The other world founders clearly noticed the world founder's gaze and suddenly understood what he was trying to express. I think we should pay a visit to that powerhouse. Subsequently, the world founder spoke. Pay a visit? Can't you guys sense how fast the flow of time is? At this rate of time flow, I think that expert is probably bottomless as well. Another world creator spoke up. Bottomless? If it was in the past, I would think so. But now, as long as that powerhouse isn't dead, "I won't dare to have such thoughts," said the world founder who said he wanted to pay a visit. His words silenced the many founders of the world. These words were clearly the true thoughts in everyone's hearts. One must know that the strength and intelligence that Luo Fan had displayed all along had left an indescribable shadow in their hearts. Under such a psychological shadow, although Luo Fan wasn't omnipotent in their eyes, he wasn't far from it. With the existence of such a terrifying shadow, it was obviously embarrassing for them to say that Luo Fan had made a mistake or that he was unsure of anything. "I think it's fine to pay a visit. It's best if it's before the world is established." The creator of the world, who had failed the second Great Tribulation, agreed to the suggestion, which was a rare occurrence. Hearing his words, the expressions of the other world founders changed slightly. But very soon, they came to a sudden realization and knew what the other party's intentions were. "I think it's fine," said one of the world founders. The other world founders also echoed and nodded in agreement. In the end, there wasn't a single world founder who objected to such a ridiculous suggestion. All the world founders expressed that it was worth doing, whether directly or indirectly. At this moment, everyone was well aware of the thoughts of the other world founders. Even their own thoughts were more or less the same. However, none of them were able to make sense of the situation, and all of them pretended to be confused. Their idea was none other than to directly build their own world into the core of the transportation network layer, just like the world of the laws of the world. Although the appearance of the world was a little special and strange, it was still superior to all the worlds that the world founders had established. Such an existence had value for them to imitate and study. In order to achieve such a goal, it was obviously impossible to just observe and investigate from the outside. The best way was to let Luo Fan tell them the secret directly. If possible, he could even teach them step by step. Among the cultivators, one of them looked at the eager expressions of the cultivators. His expression did not change at all, but he sighed inwardly. The world founder was the ruler of the first world that Luo Fan encountered that had suffered a tribulation. He was also the world founder that Luo Fan had directly imparted his cultivation path to him. Because this world founder had already cultivated Luo Fan's cultivation path, his worldview had unknowingly deviated from Luo Fan's worldview, and the world that he established was almost completely tied to the world of laws. It was precisely because of this that he could not break away from the previous opportunities. Of course, it was also because of this that he was able to get through the first great tribulation of the world rather easily. After that, because he had no idea what the second great tribulation of the world was, he did not encounter the second great tribulation of the world. Of course, it was only because he did not encounter the main body of the second great tribulation. The signs that should exist were still indispensable. Moreover, because he was more familiar with the tribulation of the world, he was able to sense the dangerous aura that was being emitted by the omens of the tribulation that he couldn't sense. It was precisely because he sensed such an aura that he came here at this time to participate in the exchange with the many world founders. Clearly, he intended to use the wisdom of the world founders to find a way to get through the second great tribulation. But unfortunately, in the end, the world founders still thought of the same choice as he did back then, which was to directly imitate the world of laws. Obviously, this made him quite disappointed. However, at this time, he still had some wishful thinking in his heart. Perhaps the world of laws at this time was already completely different from before, and with the current structure of the world of laws, it could easily get through the second great tribulation. It was precisely because of this wishful thinking that he did not speak up to stop everyone at this time. Obviously, the world founders would leave as they said they would. Since everyone had already agreed to the overall decision, they naturally would not hesitate any longer. One by one, the world founders left the world and headed towards the world of laws that was like a nebula in the center. The closer they got to the world of laws, the clearer they felt that the world had become. The existence that originally shrouded the world of laws like a dense fog began to gradually disappear, and by the time they arrived in front of the world of laws, all the fog had disappeared without a trace. The entire world looked like a normal world, as if it was no different from their own world. What's the principle behind this? The world founders were confused by this change, and they could not understand what was going on at all. However, this also increased their confidence in Luo Fan, and they also had more expectations for the answer that they might get next. To be able to use such an incredible method and create such an incredible scene, it went without saying that his means were brilliant. How could they not have more expectations? The young ones seek an audience with the ruler. The world founders spoke up at this moment. Since they wanted to tie everything to Luo Fan, they naturally addressed Luo Fan as the ruler, as if they had completely forgotten how they addressed Luo Fan previously. As for the ruler, it was naturally the ruler of the transportation network layer. This sentence was repeated 3 times before a figure was projected from the world of laws and appeared in front of everyone. However, what surprised everyone was that the figure in front of them was not the Luo Fan that they knew, but a complete stranger. A stranger who looked incomparably indifferent and noble, as if he was a supreme existence that controlled everything in the universe. The aura of this man was so noble and mysterious. When they sensed this stranger, they felt as if they could directly sense the world and the supreme great Tao. After the man appeared, he glanced at everyone indifferently and said, "Master isn't free. What's the matter? This is the heavenly Tao." At this moment, similar thoughts flashed through the minds of many world founders. Although it was just a sentence, who were they? They were all pioneers who could split open the world in this simulated state of primal chaos, and had even lived here for countless trillions of years. As such world founders, there was no need to mention how sharp their thinking was. The breadth of his knowledge went without saying. At this moment, from the man's words, they had already guessed that he was a heavenly Tao from his tone, and the content of his words. He actually created a heavenly Tao in his own world. Isn't he afraid of being devoured by the heavenly Tao? This was the next thought that appeared in the minds of the world founders. The existence of the heavenly Tao seemed to make the world more powerful and accurate in dealing with all kinds of changes. It also made it more convenient for the world founders. However, the greater the benefits, the greater the disadvantages. Because the heavenly Tao was an existence below the great Tao and above the laws, it had all kinds of authority and mysteries of the great Tao. This made it qualified to replace the great Tao. However, because it was ultimately not a great Tao, everything about the heavenly Tao was clearly limited. This restriction made the heavenly Tao dance with its legs shackled. It was truly uncomfortable and oppressive. It would be fine if the heavenly Tao did not have the will of a living being. Without the will of a living being, it naturally would not treat these restrictions as restrictions. It would not treat dancing with its legs shackled as a form of torture. On the contrary, it might even treat this as an even more wonderful feeling. However, it was clear that although the will of the heavenly Tao was not the true will of a living being, it still possessed a portion of the characteristics of a living being's will. This characteristic made it impossible for the heavenly Tao to be as indifferent and aloof as the will of a living being, treating all restrictions as a form of charm. For a will that was between a living being and a non-living being, these restrictions would obviously make it feel extremely uncomfortable. And this uncomfortable feeling would continue to accumulate and grow. After an infinite amount of time, it would eventually grow to a level that could overturn everything. When that time came, the heavenly Tao would become the enemy of the world and the great Tao. Once the heavenly Tao developed to that level, then all the authority it was given would greatly affect or even harm the world, the great Tao, and even the creators of the world. This was something that all the creators of the world knew very well. It was precisely because of this that even though they knew that the existence of the heavenly Tao would make things easier for them, none of them constructed a heavenly Tao in the world they created. Even if some had no choice but to construct a heavenly Tao to deal with things, they would definitely erase it after the matter was resolved, so as to avoid any future worries. And now, the ruler of the transportation network layer, whom they regarded as a role model, had created a heavenly Tao in its own world. Moreover, looking at the appearance of the heavenly Tao, the proportion of the will of a living being was actually several times greater than that of an ordinary heavenly Tao. How could they not be shocked? It was already a hidden danger because of the will of a living being, and now it's increasing the proportion of the will of a living being. What's the reason for this? Is it a mistake, a lack of knowledge? Or is there some trump card that can prevent the hidden danger from appearing? Many creators of the world were extremely confused. If it was a heavenly Tao created by other creators of the world, they would definitely have endlessly cast their disdain towards it. After all, this kind of behavior was too against common sense. No matter how they looked at it, it did not seem like something that a creator of the world with knowledge would do. However, the one who created the heavenly Tao was Luo Fan. Even if this matter defied their knowledge and was different from their common sense, they had no choice but to take a few more turns to see if they were wrong. They wanted to see if Luo Fan had any special intentions, or if Luo Fan had some special preparation, or if their common sense was simply wrong. Chapter 27-28. The Heavenly Will naturally did not care about the doubts and bewilderment of the other world founders. He only looked at them and waited for them to answer his question. After a long while, the pioneers finally reacted. They bowed towards the heavenly law and obediently stated their requests. You want Master's guidance? Don't even think about it. Master doesn't have the time to guide you now. The Heavenly Will said indifferently. There was no trace of hesitation in his expression, and it was obvious that there was no room for compromise at all. The world founders were not too surprised by such an answer. After all, they didn't actually have a very deep relationship with the hegemon. It was a little too much to ask the ruler to guide them in their cultivation. However, that wasn't their true goal. At this time, some of the world founders took a step back and asked the Heavenly Will to let them enter the world of laws to experience it. They wanted to experience the ruler's supreme world and experience his creativity and wisdom. They hoped that it would give them some stimulation and inspiration. The Heavenly Will was about to refuse when his brows suddenly twitched. He seemed to have received something. At that moment, he changed his mind and went along with the flow and agreed. However, he made a request. The world founders could not enter the world of laws with their real bodies. They could only enter with their clones. Moreover, these clones could not carry a trace of power, nor could they bring in their own characteristics of the world. Hearing this, the world founders frowned slightly. They did not feel anything when they entered with their clones. After all, their clones were also themselves. What their clones saw and felt was no different from what they saw and felt. They wanted to experience Luo Fan's world of laws and understand the subtle mysteries within it. Using their clones was enough. However, if their clones did not carry any power or the characteristics of their own world, it would obviously not meet their requirements. If they did not carry any power, wouldn't their clones be just a mortal? When a mortal entered a world with their naked eyes, what they saw was only the surface of the world. As for the truth of heaven and earth, the various profound mysteries within heaven and earth, and the various special characteristics that existed within heaven and earth, it was obvious that he couldn't obtain them. Under such circumstances, what was the difference between entering it and entering their own world? Since there is no difference, why should he enter? Some of the world's founders immediately objected. Regarding their significance, the heavenly axiom only replied, "Those who do not agree to the conditions cannot enter." His words instantly rendered the other world founders speechless. At this moment, they were pleading with the heavenly Tao, pleading with Luo Fan. But it was not that the heavenly Tao was begging them. The heavenly Tao had already laid out all the conditions in front of him. If you agree, you can enter. If you don't agree, you can't enter. It was that simple. The world founders exchanged glances with one another. In the end, they sighed and agreed one by one. In any case, even if they didn't gain anything, they wouldn't lose anything. Since that was the case, he naturally had to go in and take a look. What if he was lucky and obtained something useful? As for being humiliated by the Heaven Tao, it was obviously nothing to them. They clearly knew that the other party was the Heaven Tao, and that it didn't have a complete consciousness of a living being, yet they still treated it as if it was a living being. If they still felt embarrassed after being humiliated, they were clearly asking for it. Seeing that all the world founders had agreed, the heavenly Tao nodded. Since you've all agreed, send your clones over. I'll bring you in. The creators of the world nodded in agreement. Their bodies flickered, and clones without any power began to condense from their bodies. They were then sent to the heavenly Tao by their true bodies. If they were ordinary clones, they would naturally be able to directly enter their destination and enter the world in front of them. However, it was clear that they wanted to form clones without any power, without any characteristics of their own world. Such an incarnation looked just like an ordinary person. At most, they were innately thousands of times stronger than ordinary people. Living beings at such a level clearly didn't have the power to move freely in the transportation network. Therefore, they could only use the power of their main bodies to protect the clones, and then hand them over to the Heaven Tao like goods. The Heaven Tao received the clones, and with a wave of his hand, the strands of extraordinary power that the clones carried were swept away. Even the fundamental laws that formed them underwent various, indescribable changes. They were no longer the clones that the world founders had constructed with their own worldviews. Instead, they had been changed into clones that were constructed with a completely different worldview, but one that they felt was rather familiar with. Evidently, the heavenly Tao had changed the essence of these clones in just a flash, making these clones be built with the worldview of laws as their foundation. Only then could it be considered to be completely free of the special characteristics of the creator of the world. At this moment, the world founders used the connection between their clones and their main bodies to instantly sense the changes in their clones. All sorts of indescribable comprehensions appeared in their hearts, as if they had comprehended something, but also as if they were separated by a layer and did not comprehend anything at all. The Heaven Tao ignored the world founders and turned around to bring the clones into the world of laws. In that instant, the expressions of all the world founders changed drastically. What's going on? Why is the flow of time so fast? In this instant, they felt that their clones seemed to have lived for tens of thousands of years. This situation was clearly the result of the flow of time in the world of laws being billions of times faster than the outside world. Fortunately, the clones were under the protection of the Heaven Tao, and the foundation that the Heaven Tao had reconstructed for the clones also contained various subtle characteristics, which allowed the clones without any power to not die of old age due to the acceleration of time. Otherwise, even if the world founders were of different races and had different lifespans, they would not have been able to last for too long without any extraordinary power. After experiencing tens of thousands of years, there was a 70 to 80% chance that they would have died of old age. Faced with such a situation, none of the world founders felt relieved at this moment. Instead, all of them felt extremely solemn. After all, they were world founders, so they could analyze some basic things. They had many guesses about the difference in the flow of time between their own world and the outside world's transportation network layer. They understood that if the flow of time was not forcefully controlled, it would be completely determined by the urgency deep in the heart of the world founder. If the creator of the world was extremely anxious and longed for more time, then the flow of time in the world would accelerate. The stronger the urgency, the stronger the acceleration effect would be. In this way, the flow of time in the world of laws was actually very fast. A breath of time in the outside world was equivalent to tens of thousands of years inside. This was enough to show how anxious the world founder was. Who was the creator of this world? The world founder was Luo Fan, the ruler of the transportation network layer. He was the one who appeared alone in the simulation of chaos and was able to overturn the entire simulation of chaos in an extremely short time. In the end, he even formed the transportation network layer and became a huge mountain above the heads of the world founders. Such an existence was so powerful and had such great means that even the most proud world founders knew that they were far inferior to him. And now, in a corner that they couldn't see, the world founder was actually so anxious and needed so much time in such a shocking flow of time? How could they not feel goosebumps? What kind of danger is it? Why does he need so much time? One of the world founders murmured as his face turned extremely pale. Although the other world founders did not answer at this time, it was obvious that they were all thinking about similar questions. The more they understood Luo Fan's strength, the more they knew how much danger there was. At this time, they suddenly felt that the things they were worried about before were completely meaningless. If even such an existence was so inconceivably dangerous, then what was the point of their previous struggles? Even if the world completely turned into a world of laws, so what? Amidst all these thoughts, their clones had already entered the world of laws. However, what surprised them was that after they entered the world of laws, none of them sensed the existence of other world founders. It was as if they were the only outsiders in the entire world. What's going on? Why do I feel this way? At this moment, they already knew that there was no point in being conflicted. Although their clones did not contain any power, nor did they possess any special characteristics of the world, the heavenly Tao had already bestowed them all sorts of authority, making it so that they were not like ordinary beings in this world, only able to see the surface of a world and only the surface of the world. At this moment, the clones of the founders of the world possessed all sorts of unimaginable abilities. They could easily see the various secrets of the world, including the laws, the hidden grand Daos, and even the heavenly Daos that enveloped the world. It was precisely because of this that they were even more surprised. They were surprised that they actually did not sense the existence of any other world founders' incarnations in this world. Could it be that there's a limit to this kind of sensing, and we can't sense the existence of other incarnations? Some world founders thought in this way, with their hearts filled with bewilderment. This situation seemed to make sense, but in reality, none of them really thought so. After all, it was completely meaningless to do so. Based on the bearing that Luo Fan had displayed, he was clearly not worried about them forming a connection. Moreover, even if he was really worried, he would not use such a method to stop them from forming a connection. After all, their main bodies were still in the outside world, and they were in the same place. Under such circumstances, what was the point of preventing the incarnations from sensing each other? In that case, there seemed to be only one possibility after thinking about it. That was, the world where their clones resided was indeed not the same world. There was clearly only one world in front of them, and their incarnations had clearly entered the same world, so why did they appear in different worlds in the end? They naturally could not understand this matter if it did not make sense. But as long as it made sense, it could not be any simpler. It's a parallel world. One of the world founders finally concluded with an indescribable doubt on his face. In the scope of their understanding, it seemed that only parallel space-time, parallel dimension, parallel space, parallel time, parallel universe, and parallel heaven and earth could occur in different worlds within the same world. But why? Why did the heavenly Tao send them into so many different parallel universes? What was the point of doing this? What could the other party achieve? In that instant, many of the founders of the world felt as if there was a huge hand looming over them, controlling them. Perhaps we're sheep in a tiger's mouth this time. Such a thought flashed through the minds of some world founders. Of course, this thought was quickly erased. Sheep in a tiger's mouth was already a sheep in a tiger's mouth. What was the point of saying it now? At most, it would only make the heavenly Tao, or rather, Luo Fan, unhappy. And if the other party was unhappy, then it might be a disaster for him. Under such circumstances, the world founders stole glances at the others. They discovered that their gazes were flickering slightly, as if they were thinking of something. Clearly, the other world founders could think of what he could think of as well. At that moment, everyone was already well aware of what was going on. What kind of parallel world is it? Perhaps we should confirm it first, one of the world founders said. His expression was extremely calm, and there was not a trace of strangeness in it. Chapter 27-29. After determining what parallel universes they were in, they could guess Luo Fan's possible intentions through their characteristics. This was obviously the best way to break out of the predicament that they could think of in such a terrible situation. While they were contemplating for a short while, hundreds of thousands of years had already passed in the world of laws. Among the many parallel universes, the actions of the world's creators had already had a great impact on the parallel universes, causing them to become completely different from when they first entered. This difference involved all aspects of the parallel universes. Some had an impact on the secular world, some had an impact on the cultivation world, and some had even directly penetrated deep into the layer of laws and laws, causing a great impact on the layer of laws and laws. Among the many parallel universes, the existences of the world's creators were all at the level of mortals at the beginning. The various characteristics that were related to their own world had also been erased and severed. However, they were still the world's creators after all, existences that had been tempered by the simulated state of chaos for countless trillions of years. Their wisdom still existed after all. As long as this kind of unimaginable wisdom existed, it would naturally begin to affect the surroundings. And this kind of influence continued to expand, and naturally, it would cause all kinds of changes in the parallel universes. And there were good and bad changes in this kind of change. The good was that the parallel universes would grow greatly, allowing the entire parallel universes to improve a little. The bad was that the parallel universes would become chaotic. However, regardless of whether it was good or bad, they didn't encounter any obstruction from the heavenly Tao. After the heavenly Tao sent them to the parallel universes, it completely ignored them as if they didn't exist at all. It completely let them do whatever they wanted in the parallel universes. As for the incarnations of the world's creators, after hundreds of thousands of years of development, they were no longer the same as they were in the past. As the incarnations of the world's creators, no matter what, these creatures had a desire for power that couldn't be ignored. This desire caused them to abhor the fact that they were mere mortals. In a situation where they were unable to use the various special characteristics and profound mysteries of the world of laws that were different from this world of laws, they could only obediently start exploring according to the situation of this world of laws, following the various rules of this world of laws, and following the various characteristics of the parallel world of laws to start searching for power. Under this kind of pursuit, they naturally began to gradually grow according to the parallel cultivation system they were in. Over the past hundreds of thousands of years, he had practically stood at the peak of his level. The reason why they were stuck at this realm was because of the limitations of the parallel realm. It wasn't because they were truly limited to this realm and couldn't break through. At this moment, in the world of origin laws, the heavenly Tao above the void was invisible and was observing the incarnations of the world's founders from all sorts of subtle perspectives. He observed the various activities they carried out and felt the various effects those activities had on the entire world. In fact, the heavenly Tao, or rather, Luo Fan, didn't intend to let the incarnations of the world's founders complete a specific goal in his world of laws. In other words, to him, no matter what the incarnations of the world's founders did, as long as they were in this world of laws, as long as they were in the many parallel universes, they could do whatever they wanted. Even if they had to bring those parallel universes to the end of the world, it didn't matter, because at this time his more important goal was to find the influence of a higher level world that might exist in his world of laws. Or rather, to find the hidden dangers that existed in his world of laws. Under such circumstances, no matter what the incarnations of the world's founders did in the parallel universes, they were actually triggering changes in the world of laws. And this kind of change was originally something he couldn't cause himself. It was also something that the creatures in the parallel universes in this world of laws couldn't cause. Only those foreign worlds' founders with a worldview that was completely different from the world of laws and a way of thinking that was completely different from the creatures in the world of laws could cause it. After all, although the incarnations of the world's founders didn't bring the characteristics of their respective worlds into this world of laws, their own way of thinking was already completely different from any creature in this world of laws. When they looked at their worldview, they looked at everything in the world of laws. Obviously, They observed everything from a completely different perspective and measured everything in a completely different way of thinking. In this way, the same thing, the same phenomenon, the reactions they made, and the cognition they produced would be completely different. With such different results, the commotion they caused naturally wouldn't be small. In the end, the changes that occurred in the parallel universes naturally couldn't be small. The increase in the changes caused by the parallel universes would naturally reveal all kinds of problems that were originally hidden in the world, as well as the existence of all kinds of hidden dangers that originally existed outside of one's perspective. And these are the most important things to Luo Fan. Apart from that, everything else, such as the worldview of the world's founders, the wisdom of the world's founders, and the various treasures of the world's founders were obviously secondary. Facing such a situation, he naturally couldn't be bothered to care about the incarnations of the world's founders. As for the various means that the world's founders used to explore the truth of the parallel universes and explore the intentions of the heavenly Tao, he was more than happy to see it happen. Naturally, it was impossible for him to have any thoughts of stopping them. Those world's founders were constantly integrating what they saw with each other outside. And with the help of this integration, they worked hard to guess the nature of the parallel universes where their incarnations were. The wisdom of these world's founders was extremely extraordinary, and their ability to deduce and guess was naturally self-evident. For something that didn't have any reference answers at all, they were able to quickly deduce a general idea. Vaguely, they had already determined the parallel universes where most of the incarnations were. It seems that my incarnation should be in a parallel universe somewhere. Mine should be in a parallel universe. Mine should be in a parallel universe. If that's the case, I should be in a strange parallel universe. Many worlds' founders integrated each other, and all of them looked at each other in dismay. This kind of distribution was really too scattered. Not only were there no incarnations of the world's founders in the same parallel universe, but there weren't even any parallel universes of the same kind. It felt as if they had been randomly scattered in there. But was this possible? From their own perspective, they put themselves in Luo Fan's shoes and suddenly realized that it was absolutely impossible for them, the world's founders, to scatter their incarnations and without a purpose at such a critical time. Since it was impossible for them to scatter them in randomly, there was clearly a purpose and a corresponding thought. To them, this kind of goal and this kind of thinking seemed to be random and confusing. However, it clearly represented a fact. That was, their gazes weren't enough to see through each other's intentions, and they weren't able to see through each other's thoughts. I think we've fallen into a misunderstanding, one of the world's founders said at that moment. This world's founder was none other than the one who had received Luo Fan's teachings and cultivated in Luo Fan's path of cultivation, using it to escape the first calamity of the world. At that moment, the world's founder's expression was extremely calm, and there was no change in his demeanor because of the predicament they were in. It was as if he was having afternoon tea with a good friend. The other world's founders grew curious when they heard his words. "What do you mean, fellow Taoist? How did we fall into a misunderstanding?" One of the world's founders asked. "Isn't our goal to absorb creativity and ideas to change our world? What are we doing now?" The world's founder asked. His words stunned all the other heaven and earth pioneers. Ever since they discovered that their incarnations had been thrown into different parallel universes, they had been constantly thinking about Luo Fan's intentions, as well as the heavenly axiom's intentions. Most of their energy was focused on exploring the secrets within. Their original goal was to figure out all the secrets of this world of laws, understand the profundities of its structure, and understand the profundities of its concepts before applying them to their own world of laws. However, this was something that they had tossed aside. After being reminded by the world's founder, they came to a sudden realization that they had really fallen into a misunderstanding. In the end, it's because he's giving us too much pressure. Another world's founder sighed. It was obvious that his words were not an excuse, but a fact. They, the world's founders, should not have forgotten their original intentions so easily. They should not have forgotten their true goals so easily. However, it was ultimately because the pressure that Luo Fan had given them was too great. It was big enough for them to treat him as the focus of their attention the moment they saw him, as if his every move was more important than all their thoughts. Only in this way could their thoughts be disrupted by the heavenly axiom's words and completely forget their original intentions with a casual action. Hearing his words, the other world's founders could only smile bitterly. Although this was the truth, it was not pleasant to hear. They were world's founders, and so was Luo Fan. They did not think that they were any worse than Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, they should have been able to do what Luo Fan could do. The pressure that Luo Fan was able to bring to them, they should have been able to bring it to Luo Fan. However, they could not bring any pressure to Luo Fan at all, and the pressure that Luo Fan brought to them had completely controlled their minds. No matter how they looked at it, it was a shameful thing. At this moment, the world's founders fell into silence. One by one, the world's founders began to attach their minds to their clones, and with the help of their clones, they began to explore the parallel world that their clones were in and experience all the mysteries of the parallel world. The difference between the parallel plane and the origin law heaven and earth was actually more limited to the surface, or rather, the surface. In essence, they were exactly the same as the origin of the world. All the parallel worlds still followed Luo Fan's worldview of the laws. Everything was constructed according to the standards of the worldview of the laws. Therefore, although they were in different parallel worlds, the clones of the world's founders would not obstruct them from comprehending the essence of Luo Fan's worldview of the laws. Under such circumstances, comprehending and exploring the world among the many parallel existences was actually not much different from exploring the world of the origin laws of the world. However, this difference was not small for the heavenly Tao, or rather for Luo Fan. For Luo Fan, the different parallel worlds were different manifestations of the law worldview, or rather, the different possibilities of the law worldview. The various changes caused by the clones of the world's founders in many parallel worlds were equivalent to the deep layers of these possibilities being constantly churned out, and the secrets that were originally hidden in the depths were constantly being uncovered. Different worlds' founders had different perspectives, and the way they uncovered these secrets was also different. And this difference was enough for Luo Fan to experience his own world from different aspects and perspectives, and thus discover many things that he could not discover before. And these things that he could not discover before were obviously of great benefit to his comprehension of the influence of other worlds that might exist in this world. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan gradually began to focus his attention on the clones of the world's founders. It's still too few. Perhaps I should gather more world's founders. At a certain moment, such a thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind. Chapter 27:30. Very quickly, he made a decision. Although there weren't many world founders in the transportation network layer, almost all of them had been thrown into his world of laws and played the role he wanted them to play in the many parallel existences. However, this didn't mean that there were only a few world founders that he could find. In fact, the number of world founders in the simulated state of chaos was countless times more than he had imagined. At this moment, wasn't the sky full of stars the endless world? Every world naturally had a creator of that world. This way, if he wanted more world founders to cooperate with his cultivation and his understanding of the world of laws, as long as he could find a way, he could have as many as he wanted. The premise was that he could find a way. If it was before, it would naturally be impossible for him to find a way. But at this time, after his understanding of the simulated state of chaos deepened and the connection between the worlds deepened, he naturally vaguely understood what he should do to achieve his goal. Perhaps this is also a verification. Such a thought flashed in his mind, and he finally completely determined what he should do. At this moment, his heart trembled slightly, and an indescribable expression appeared on his face. He turned his wooden tube towards the sky, where two extremely broken galaxies were located in the boundless darkness. Those two broken galaxies were none other than the remnants of the many worlds that had been separated from his transportation network layer. At this moment, the two massive worlds had already completely collapsed, turning back into countless worlds. The originally complete world could only remain as a remnant of history. The reason why they had become so broken and even split again was, of course, very simple. It was because the power of the tribulation had completely caused the many worlds to fall and completely destroy them, making it impossible for them to connect with each other. In the end, they could only completely collapse and turn into endless worlds again. In comparison, the second world was in an even worse state. It was even more damaged than the first world. The first world, which was the first batch of worlds to break away from the transportation network layer, performed much better. Of course, if the creators of the worlds that remained in the transportation network layer discovered the first world's performance, they would perhaps be extremely shocked. After all, in their eyes, that batch of worlds had already completely broken free from the influence of the tribulations. How did it suddenly become so broken, as if it had been completely crushed by the tribulations? However, Luo Fan knew very well that this was a matter of course. In fact, the development of these worlds was not surprising at all. After all, these worlds were worlds that existed in a simulated primal chaos state. Since it was a world that existed in a simulated chaotic state, it would naturally be affected by the fundamental laws of the simulated chaotic state, and would naturally be affected by the tribulation level. So, even if they could escape the effects of the tribulation for a while, it was impossible for them to escape the effects of the tribulation forever. Previously, when they escaped, it was only to escape the wave of disaster in the transportation network layer. It was not a true detachment. Once there was a world among them that could trigger the tribulation level and trigger the first great world tribulation, then based on the relationship between those worlds and the situation where those worlds eventually combined into a complete world, all of them would directly fall into the tribulation. Now, in reality, those worlds were still in the midst of the tribulation. Even those worlds that had been completely destroyed in the world's tribulation seemed to have just been destroyed. This was obviously the most obvious manifestation of the independence of the many worlds' time in the simulated chaotic state. This was because time had such independence. Therefore, the time that these worlds experienced was completely different. The worlds in the transportation network layer might have already experienced billions of years, but to these worlds, it might only be a few days or even a few hours. Of course, the difference in the flow of light naturally could not be that great. However, it would not be too little after all. After all, the creators of the worlds thought that they had already escaped danger and were no longer affected by the tribulations, so they were naturally extremely relaxed and calm. Once they were relaxed and calm, the flow of time in their world would naturally begin to slow down. In the end, perhaps they would become anxious during the tribulation, but the acceleration of the flow of time brought about by this anxiety was no longer enough to surpass the time that they had wasted before. Therefore, they behaved this way at this moment. That was why they had only just survived the tribulation even after such a long time had passed in the transportation network layer. Facing such a situation, Luo Fan could still see those worlds struggling in the tribulation with just a glance. Moreover, because the flow of time in the world of laws was so fast that it was trillions of times faster than the outside world, the changes of the stars in the sky were extremely slow. It was simply like a fixed picture. Even the attacks that the many worlds suffered during the tribulation were completely clear, without the slightest omission. There's still a repulsive effect, and it's even stronger than before. At this moment, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. What he was thinking was naturally the interaction between his world of laws and those worlds at this moment. Those worlds were separated from the transportation network layer, so in their hearts, they were naturally betraying Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, they were naturally extremely repulsive towards the world of laws. This repulsive effect would naturally turn into a real repulsive effect. This was the characteristic of the simulated state of chaos. In fact, it wasn't just the simulated state of chaos, but the characteristic of the entire state of chaos. Obviously, for Luo Fan, the repulsive effect was stronger than the attractive effect. With a thought, He began to control the repulsive effect that he had on the many worlds. Under his control, these repulsive effects began to produce changes similar to what had happened in the past. They began to forcibly seize the interactions between those worlds and other worlds, and began to forcibly form strange programs that were installed on those worlds. They began to change those worlds in an extremely fundamental way. Now, it was no longer as strenuous for him to do these things. As he continued to improve, his understanding of the essence of the simulated state of chaos continued to strengthen, and his understanding of the essence of the many worlds continued to deepen. Now, he already had the temperament to do such things as if they were nothing. The things that were originally bumpy seemed to have turned into instincts that didn't require him to think at all. Originally, he still needed to forcibly use various means to distort and modify the various programs, and he even needed to resist the backlash of those worlds themselves. But now, with just a thought from him, those worlds had even begun to cooperate on their own. Of course, because of the simulated state of chaos, there was no real simulated chaotic layer to communicate with, so he couldn't directly sense the situation of those worlds, and he couldn't directly send his thoughts into those worlds. It was precisely because of this that he couldn't directly form his own program incarnation in a certain world like he did in the transportation network layer back then. However, although he couldn't directly form a program incarnation, his control over these repulsive effects and interactions had become increasingly perfect. Therefore, the programs he constructed were already like real artificial intelligence, or even like real living beings. The things that he could do were tens of thousands of times more than normal programs. In fact, after these programs appeared, they even triggered a reaction from the tribulations, and the tribulations even began to treat them as targets of attack. However, these programs already contained Luo Fan's understanding of the tribulations, and they already contained his experience of passing through two tribulations. At this moment, facing the tribulations that were already nearing the end of the world, they easily passed through the tribulations. They didn't need to go through the trials of the tribulations at all, and they directly began to perform all sorts of unbelievable actions in those worlds. As these programs took action, those worlds gradually began to change. The way they resonated with each other gradually began to undergo indescribable changes. This kind of change was something that the creators of the world abhorred. However, at this moment, they were overjoyed by the changes, and none of them wanted to stop the changes at all. Instead, they even did their best to facilitate the changes. In order to complete the changes, some worlds even forcefully suppressed their repulsive instincts and were willing to suffer even greater damage from the tribulations. The changes were none other than the re-establishment of the resonance between those worlds and the transportation network layer. Once the resonance was completed, it meant that those worlds would once again be connected to the transportation network layer. If it was before, when they had just left the transportation network layer, they would naturally be extremely repulsed by this change, and they would be willing to pay a huge price to completely cut off this change. After all, in their opinion, their previous actions were a betrayal of Luo Fan, and it was an action that made Luo Fan so furious that he even wanted to completely erase them. If they had been connected to the transportation network layer at that time, then the outcome that awaited them would have been to be completely erased by Luo Fan. They might even have been unable to live or die. Under such circumstances, how could they have been willing to be connected to the transportation network layer? However, the situation now was obviously completely different. The current situation was that they were already at a dead end, and if this continued, their destruction was almost inevitable. Under such circumstances, if Luo Fan wanted to reconnect them to the transportation network layer, even if he wanted to take revenge on them and torture them, it was equivalent to giving them a new choice and a new hope. Even the fiercest world founders had to consider what to choose at this time. Therefore, the final result was like this at this moment. Not only did the world founders not stop the changes in these worlds, but on the contrary, they did their best to promote this change and did their best to help their own worlds connect to the transportation network layer. With the cooperation of the world founders, the effects of the programs were quickly displayed. In the transportation network layer that had already shrunk to the limit, blank spaces began to gradually appear. After these empty spaces appeared, the heavens and earths also began to appear in those empty spaces, completely filling up the empty spaces. Soon, the volume of the transportation network layer began to expand rapidly, and in the blink of an eye, it had expanded from the original few hundred square worlds to the point of tens of millions of square worlds. And this was already the limit. It wasn't that the other worlds rejected the transportation network layer, nor was it that they hadn't completed the connection process, but that there were only so many worlds left among the originally hundreds of millions of worlds that had separated from the transportation network layer. Only these tens of millions of worlds were left under the impact of the tribulations. Moreover, these worlds didn't just bring the worlds themselves. In addition to the worlds themselves, they also brought the effects of the tribulations. In other words, the first world tribulation that the worlds themselves encountered. However, this impact didn't cause a huge impact on the entire transportation network layer like before. The arrival of these tribulations didn't cause any changes in the transportation network layer. At this time, the transportation network layer seemed as if nothing had happened. The many worlds in the transportation network layer were still the same as before, without any changes due to the arrival of these tribulations. Not to mention the tribulations, even the slightest change in the world didn't happen. The reason for this was very simple. For the original worlds in the transportation network layer, these tribulations were of a very low level. Chapter 2731. No matter how bad the world was, it had already experienced the great tribulation of the world once. Even if it failed, it was still an experience after all. With the previous experience, the world creators in the transportation network layer were very clear about the signs of the first great tribulation of the world, the possible effects of the great tribulation of the world, and the possible effects of the great tribulation of the world. Under such circumstances, they were naturally able to cut off the tentacles of the great tribulation of the world the instant the great tribulation of the world spread over, so that the great tribulation of the world could not truly possess them and affect these worlds. After returning to the transportation network layer, the moment the creators of the world discovered the realm of law, they all began to seek help from Luo Fan. For them, they were not sure what Luo Fan's purpose was in accepting them back. However, no matter what the purpose was, keeping them alive was obviously a prerequisite. Therefore, at this moment, after entering the transportation network layer, they did not hesitate to ask for help from Luo Fan. After receiving their request for help, Luo Fan made up his mind, and the incarnation of the heavenly Tao projected out and began to think about the many worlds. There were a terrifying number of these worlds that were calculated in the tens of millions. Compared to the number of worlds that had left the transportation network layer, this was already an insignificant small portion. However, this number was an extremely terrifying number no matter how one looked at it. If the heavenly Tao were to communicate with them alone, it might not be able to complete the task, even if it spent hundreds or thousands of years. Therefore, Luo Fan could only let the incarnation of the heavenly Tao go. However, it was obvious that this was only a small matter to the heavenly Tao. It was not enough to pressure at all, and it was not even enough to affect the original work of the heavenly Tao. One should not forget that the heavenly Tao was originally an existence that could absolutely and perfectly control all the signs of the Great Tribulation of the world, causing all the signs of the Second Great Tribulation of the world to disappear completely without a sound. If it was willing, it would only be a matter of time for it to create billions of incarnations, and it cannot be any easier for it to create tens of millions of incarnations. The incarnation entered those worlds and arrived in the depths of those worlds, arriving in front of the creators of those worlds. After coming here, no matter how weak the pioneers were, they all discovered the essence of the incarnation of the heavenly way. Every single one of them was equally shocked. They found it hard to imagine that Luo Fan could actually create the heavenly way. They even began to feel suspicious, wondering if they had overlooked something. Was there any benefit to the existence of the heavenly way that could suppress the hidden dangers? However, these thoughts only flashed through their minds for a moment. No matter how good the situation was, the world was in a precarious situation. Perhaps the entire world would collapse in the next instant. Under such circumstances, how could they have the time to pay attention to other things that had nothing to do with the safety of their world? At this time, they hurriedly begged the heavenly Tao to gnaw at the embodiment of Luo Fan's heavenly Tao to help them resist the tribulations. If you want my master to help you deal with the tribulations, that's not a problem. All you need to do is sign a contract, the heavenly Tao incarnation said. A contract? The pioneers had the same reaction. They were all dumbfounded, unable to imagine that such words could come out of the mouth of the incarnation of the heavenly Tao. What kind of existence was a contract? It was something that only existed in the mortal world of cultivation. Even in the immortal path, contracts were not very useful. Once one obtained a holy name, even if one was a quasi-saint, the contract would no longer be of any use. Moreover, they were existences that were at least equivalent to tribulation cultivators. For existences at their level, what was the point of a contract? With their methods, no matter how strong the contract was, it would only take a certain amount of time and effort to resolve it easily. It would not be able to reach the restrictive effect of any contract at all. However, at this time, they actually heard the word contract from the mouth of the unfathomable incarnation of the heavenly Tao once again. Furthermore, it was a contract that they had to sign. How could they not be dumbfounded and confused? Are you referring to that contract? Some of the pioneers asked. Evidently, they could not understand why such lowly words would come out of the other party's mouth. The incarnation of the heavenly Tao simply nodded. That's right. It is what you understand as a contract. How about it? Do you want to sign it? No problem. It doesn't matter what kind of contract it is, one of the pioneers who had low moral integrity replied. Evidently, they had already planned to break the contract as soon as the matter was settled and escape the restrictions of the contract. With such a plan, whether or not the contract existed and what kind of contract it was did not matter to them. It was the same even if it was a master-servant contract. One of the pioneers who still had some moral integrity said, "Well, you should know that a contract doesn't mean much to us, right? If that's the case, we might accidentally break it." Of course, this kind of words had already expressed their intentions clearly. If they accidentally broke it, they were clearly saying that they would do their best to break the contract. Any ordinary person would have done the same thing, let alone a creator of the universe. A contract was a restriction. Any existence, regardless of intelligence, would not like to be restricted. As long as there was a chance, anyone would choose to break the contract. The pioneers believed that Luo Fan would understand this. If you can break it, then it is your ability. Master will not trouble you, the incarnation of the heavenly Tao said without hesitation. Hearing this, some of the smarter pioneers felt an indescribable sense of unease. This calmness and confidence seemed to indicate that the contract wasn't simple. It wouldn't be that easy to break it. However, the arrow was already knocked on the bowstring, and they had no choice but to release it. Even though they knew that something was wrong and that the contract wasn't simple, they could only agree to it. Although there were tens of millions of pioneers, none of them rejected the contract offered by the incarnation of the heavenly Tao. Apart from a few worlds that could no longer withstand the attacks of the tribulations during the discussion and were completely destroyed by the tribulations, it was also the destruction of these worlds that gave the creators motivation. That's right, they were even more decisive when signing the contract. After all, no one knew if they would be the next to be destroyed. The contract that the incarnation of the heavenly Tao took out quickly made the pioneers understand why the incarnation was willing to use the contract to ensure their cooperation. Because the witnesses of the contract were none other than the tribulations. To them, it was the tribulations that filled the entire simulated chaotic state and served as the background of the simulated chaotic state. They could appear at any time and in any location. Once they violated the terms of the contract, they would definitely trigger the tribulations. At that time, endless tribulations would pour down on them and eventually destroy them completely. Apart from that, once they broke the contract, the contract would also release the final remnants of its power and channel the power of the tribulations. Yes, the power of the tribulations would pour into their lands and even into their bodies, directly destroying their lands and bodies. This didn't completely cut off their hopes of breaking the contract, nor did it completely cut off the possibility of them breaking the contract. However, this increased the risk of breaking the contract by countless times. If they made even the slightest mistake, the outcome they encountered now would be their future. In fact, it might even be worse and more tragic than what they encountered now. After discovering this, most of the world's founders had already given up. Of course, this was only the majority. With so many pioneers, there would always be those who wouldn't give up until they saw the coffin. After realizing that as long as they could break the contract perfectly and prevent it from connecting to the tribulations, they would make up their minds to break the contract themselves. Some of them even started breaking the contract on the spot. Because they broke the contract, the power of the tribulations was finally channeled into their lands. The power of the tribulations began to surge into their lands and obliterated them completely. They even lost half of their lives. However, all of this was hidden within the tribulations. Because those lands were still within the tribulations, they weren't able to escape the influence of the tribulations. Therefore, it was difficult to tell if they were just unlucky and didn't get Luo fans' help, or if they weren't clever enough and failed to break the contract, thus triggering the backlash of the contract, of course. What kind of people were these world pioneers? Even if they couldn't figure it out, they knew that some of them thought that they had absolute confidence and took the initiative to break the contract. After knowing this, they naturally became more cautious and paid more attention to the contract. May I ask when the help will arrive? I can't hold on much longer. One of the world pioneers said carefully to the incarnation of the heavens will in front of him. Hearing this, the incarnation of the heavens will said indifferently. As long as you send your incarnation over, I'll be able to help you survive this tribulation. Hearing this, the world pioneers couldn't help but be dumbfounded. What did that mean? Did that mean that the incarnation of the heavens was the help? How is that possible? Although he didn't see the specific number, the incarnations of the heavens that were released from the world of laws were probably in the tens of millions. With so many incarnations of the heavens it was doubtful how much power each of them had. Under such circumstances, could an incarnation of the heavens that didn't have much power really help their world survive this great tribulation? One must know that even under the control of world pioneers like them, it was still difficult for the world to survive the great tribulation. Otherwise, they wouldn't have had to sign a contract with the incarnation of the heavens in such a humiliating manner. However, the incarnation of the heavens had a solemn expression at this moment, and there was no change in his expression at all. It was as if what he said was absolute, inviolable, and unquestionable. Seeing this, the world pioneers knew that it was useless to say anything else. At this time, he could only trust the other party. However, he needs my incarnation. If I die, this incarnation will also collapse completely, and it will be completely useless to him. So, he probably won't deliberately deceive me. This thought appeared in the heart of the world pioneers, causing them to grit their teeth and decide to follow the other party's instructions. At that moment, he nodded and said, "I'll split out an incarnation right away." As he spoke, an incarnation that didn't have any power, didn't contain any special characteristics of his world, and didn't contain any special characteristics of his world view gradually separated from his body. This was because this was his world. Even though it was in the midst of the tribulation, he could still have absolute control over this world, and he could make the world change according to his will. Therefore, even if his incarnation didn't have any extraordinary power or any extraordinary means, he could still exist normally in this place that no ordinary living being could survive in. Moreover, he could move freely, as if he was his own body. The incarnation of the heavens carefully looked at the incarnation. After identifying it for a while, he nodded and said, "There's no problem. This incarnation meets the requirements." As he spoke, he casually waved his hand, and a ball of power directly enveloped the incarnation that didn't have any extraordinary means. Then, with a thought, he sent the incarnation out of this world like a stream of light, heading toward the core of the transportation network layer, which was like a nebula of the world of laws. During this process, streaks of light shot out from the various parts of the world, constantly rushing towards the central core of the world of laws. It felt as if countless beams of light were gathering at the center.